Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So today I'm just gonna be chilling until I gotta leave to go do the voter thingy, because we gotta get rid of a totalitarian dictator that's ruining my country. No, not Trudeau. He's turning into a better leader with every day, surprisingly. Gotta hand it to him. He's not the stupidest person I've ever talked about. Anyways, yeah, that's completely besides the point. Yeah. So we're gonna play some Total War, do the learning thing. You guys want to learn? We're gonna do some learning, and I'm not gonna be teaching. It's gonna be great. All right, let's just set this up. Make sure everything's all prim and proper. Completely violate copyright law. You know, all that other fun stuff. Alright, so let's get down to violating copyright law. Or not. Or not. Because Windows broke something. Again. Like it always does. Hello. You want to learn some history? We're going to teach you some history. It's good history, though. It's good for you. Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows.
In this video, I'm not really that interested in talking about pharaohs, or the royal court, or political intrigue. That's a completely different discussion.
Okay.
What I want to get into today is Egypt's bureaucracy, and how it functioned on a day-to-day basis.
We're gonna learn some history shit.
This is usually underemphasized by historians, but I find it utterly fascinating. In Cleopatra's Egypt, and by that I mean Egypt in the 1st century BCE, it was pretty much a totalitarian state.
First you have to apply for it.
That's a pretty crude way.
Then you have to.
The level of bureaucratic control that the government
intentionally monetize it.
Day-to-day life was extreme, even by our standards, and by ancient standards, it was off the charts. Egypt's power didn't come from its military might or from political cunning. Their power came from incredible wealth. The wealth, in turn, came from agricultural production, which was the envy of the world, and tightly controlled by the state. Almost all agricultural land in Egypt was royal land, and by that I mean that it was personally owned by the pharaohs. The ruler of Egypt, and through them the Egyptian bureaucracy, had absolute control over this land, and through the land, the wealth of the entire country. Let me give you some specific examples. Every year, the Royal Agricultural, I don't know what word to use, Ministry, Department, Bureau, let's just say the
Oh, yeah, no, it's fine. Copyright is whatever.
Farmers with the seeds that they were supposed to plant. Since it was royal land, the farmers had no choice but to accept. At harvest time, they were required to return to the royal agricultural people the exact same amount of seed that they were given to start with, along with a substantial cut of the crop yields, which served as their rent payment for the year. If you think about it, they were basically renting the seeds, too. If the farmer deviated from the state's agricultural plan in any way, they were brought up on charges and prosecuted as an oath breaker.
This isn't an audiobook. This is another person's video. Okay, so the channel that I'm listening to is Historia Civilis, I believe. Very amazing channel. I will link their stuff later.
The Romans prided themselves on their strict legalism. The Egyptians, on the other hand, prided themselves.
I am not doing the lusty Argonian maid for the fucking 7th time.
Oathbreaker with corporal punishment, when all the government wanted was to recoup their lost revenue. You see, pragmatism. Believe it or not, that was just one small aspect of Egyptian bureaucratic control. If a farmer wanted to do something simple, like cut down a tree that was in the way, they had to plead their case in front of the royal agricultural people. Think of it like municipal bylaws, with the added bonus of literally being afraid for your life and livelihood if you ever made an infraction. The fact that the
That's a hell of a
land was
bylaw.
personally owned by the pharaoh was not just a formality. It was the law, and it was drilled into the farmers' heads on a daily basis.
Let's just
The entire farming
upgrade my
system
shit.
was carefully designed by royal officials to maximize both profits and crop yields, and they were incredibly good at
I could
this.
support such a
Another
powerful
example,
fucking army right now.
If you wanted to brew alcohol, you had to apply to the government for a brewing license and pay a small fee. This sounds familiar to us,
How hard can
but
I
it was
get this thing?
virtually unheard of in the ancient world.
I can totally hit that right now.
Once you
Let's
got
go.
that license, you were required to buy barley from a state-owned company, which, on top of their arbitrary prices,
Or
was
not.
a hefty sales tax for its trouble. Once you brewed the beer, you were required to sell it back to another state-owned company at, again, arbitrary prices. That company then took that beer, turned around, and sold it for a profit. If it happened to be sold overseas, they took another cut in the form of export duties.
Da 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 da
As you
da.
can see, the government got like 5 or 6 bites at the pie before the product even made it to market. This kind of heavy taxation, where the government was involved at every step in the supply chain, was present in many industries.
Okay, what do you
We
want?
won't see a
Let's see.
system like this again until the modern age.
Military
In other
alliance.
aspects of life, state
Yeah.
intrusiveness
Let's
reached
go.
levels that we would consider unthinkable. During harvest season, people needed permission.
I am the
just to
dwarves, and I have
harvest.
allied myself with the vampires, because what we need is vampire dwarves.
In the name of profit and productivity. To be honest, this kind of reminds me of Tsarist Russia, where people needed special royal permission to move to another farm, and sometimes that permission was denied.
If you're wondering why I haven't been streaming for the last several days, I've been listening to this guy talk
Because people living under that
talk,
regime were clearly
talk.
seen as less than subjects.
for like
but
3
more
days
than
straight.
slaves. The same kind of thing could be argued for ancient Egypt. Less than subjects and more than slaves. I don't think it's
Can I
crazy
win
to
this?
say that in many ways, the rulers of Egypt
Can I win
personally
this?
owned their country. And maybe, depending on your point of view, the people in it. The entire state was basically designed from
I would
top to
love
bottom
to be a
maximize
leader in the
profits.
position where I could own
This helps to
everything on
explain
the
why
land,
the
including the
Romans, who
people.
basically didn't even have a bureaucracy, looked at the Egyptians like they were from another planet.
Alright, how can I win this?
Before you click away, a brief word. I've been really hesitant to go down the Patreon road because, frankly, I look around and almost with It occurred to me one day that Sparta, though among the most thinly populated of the states, was evidently the most powerful and most celebrated city in Greece, and I fell to wondering how this could have happened. But when I considered the institutions of the Spartans, I wondered no longer.
This guy's pretty good at talking about
So
nothing.
begins the seminal text called the Constitution of the Spartans, written by a guy called Xenophon in the early 4th century BCE.
You wanna
Xenophon
learn
was
stuff,
a
I'll
native
teach you stuff.
Athenian who was
I use the
allowed
only
to
people that
live
teach you
with
it.
the Spartans for
It's like when
several years,
a teacher
leaving
at
us
school
the best surviving account of the Spartan way
just
of
puts
life.
on a video all day.
If not
Yeah, they're getting
for
paid to
Xenophon,
have,
we
you
would
know,
know very
have you
little
watch
of
someone
their
else's
strange
work.
customs.
Okay,
What
so
were
now
these
we're gonna
strange
back
customs?
into this corner.
Basically, ancient
because
Sparta configured
I'm on the
their
defense,
entire
so
society to maximize
fuck it.
military proficiency at all costs. Their incredible discipline and their ability to mobilize
set up
their
my
entire
artillery in the
male
back.
population allowed this tiny city to become the dominant land power in Greece. Their Greek contemporaries spoke the
he
same
got a different
language
mic. This
and
is like
worshipped the
3
same
years later
gods,
after
and
that
yet
last
they all
video.
looked at Sparta like they were from another planet. So what do we know about Spartan institutions? And why did Xenophon consider them the source of Spartan strength?
Oh, Billy, how the fuck am I gonna do this? Well, first things first. Let's set up the back
Sparta
line.
was a diarchy. That means that they had 2 kings from 2 royal families who were equal in power, operating in parallel. According to Sparta's founding myth, Heracles himself came from across the sea with his supporters, conquering the land that would later become Sparta and enslaving the local Greek population.
Don't
He
you
then
just
gifted
love
this land
slavery?
to 2 of his
I
descendants,
love slavery.
the twins Eurysthenes and Procles. Their descendants would go on to found the Aegeid and Eurypontid royal dynasties, who together would rule the city for the next 700 plus years. So according to the story that they told themselves, the Spartans were foreign occupiers. This was central
And anyone that
to the
actuly comes and
Spartan
watches
identity,
my stream is
so
gonna be like,
central that
"Damn,
they viewed every
this guy's not nearly as
non-Spartan
interesting as the
a
guy
potential
speaking."
threat. This even applied to their own slaves. The descendants of the original enslaved Greeks were called the Helots. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans at, well,
oh my
we don't
god,
know.
this game's
I've
fucking
seen 3 to 1,
controls are really
I've
annoying
seen 7 to
sometimes.
1, either way, a lot. Because of this, the Spartans lived in a state of constant anxiety that the enslaved Greeks would one day get their act together
sick. Hit that
and
button.
rise
Awesome.
up against their foreign overlords. The Spartans held it as almost an article of faith that if their city ever fell, the killing blow would be delivered by a Helot rebellion. So why did they tolerate the constant stress that came with the domination of the Helots? Well, this large-scale enslavement produced a massive amount of wealth. When each Spartan male reached adulthood, the city of Sparta awarded him with an allotment of public farmland and a contingent of Helot slaves to work it.
Okay, so let's see. We're gonna have
The wealth
these
that
guys
each
come
farm
back.
generated was enough to basically turn every Spartan citizen into a landed aristocrat. In other words, they were so rich that nobody had to work for a living. And yet, even with all of this free public farmland
I'm setting my
subsidizing
men
the
up
Spartan
in
lifestyle,
a
private property still existed.
Romanesque
Why does this matter?
checkerboard
Because
pattern.
Spartan
It's
inheritance law
surprisingly
was
useful
so radical that it
for
terrified
fighting
everybody
shit.
else in
But I
Greece.
have interweaved
Stick
my
with
own
me.
stuff into
When a
this.
Spartan man died, his public allotment of farmland
So
went
I'm moving
back
my
to the
own
state,
archers to
but
fill the
his
gaps
private
in my
property went
checkerboard
to his
between
wife,
my
not his
men.
son, his wife.
So that way I
This
can
may
filter
seem like
them
a small
through.
difference at first, but consider
They can
this.
eat. They can eat a charge.
Husbands
Like my
dying
archers
young
are
was an
tough.
extremely
Like,
common
stupid
occurrence
tough.
in such
They're
a
dwarves.
militarized society. Many of these women who had inherited their husband's wealth would devote the rest of their lives to taking their small fortunes and turning them into large ones. Eventually, when these wealthy women died, their land would pass equally to their male and female children. This is the radical bit. Now imagine a rich young woman with inherited wealth marrying an equally rich young man. If that young man died in battle, which happened a lot, his wife would inherit his entire estate and go from rich to ultra rich.
It's not just for
Then
symmetry
she had her whole
purposes,
life
although
ahead of
I
her
am
to
a
expand
little
her
bit
wealth even
OCD about
further
that.
and pass
It's
it
more for
on
the
to
simple
her
fact
sons and
that
daughters.
since my archers
In other
can take a
words,
charge,
rich women tended to produce
why
more rich women. These rich women married rich men, and
why
during
tire
periods
out
when
all
lots of
my
husbands
actual
died
melee
young, this
troops
created a snowball
when
effect.
my archers are perfectly
These
acceptable in a
ultra-rich
melee?
women are sometimes referred to as the Spartan heiresses. Aristotle wrote that in his time, nearly 40% of all Spartan territory was owned and administered by a small group of extremely wealthy women. Their wealth dwarfed every other Spartans by orders of magnitude, including the 2 Spartan kings. They were a political constituency unto themselves. I want to drive this point
Jesus.
home. At times, some of the most powerful men in Sparta, even the kings, were completely dependent on loans from the Spartan heiresses. Their influence was immense. Periodically, politicians in Sparta would start talking about land reform, and every time the Spartan heiresses would block it by flooding the system with money and buying off politicians. The rest of Greece was horrified that such a small group of women had such a tight grip on Spartan politics.
Jesus.
Aristotle complains at length about how wealthy Spartan wives
No,
tended
it
to
makes sense.
dominate their less
The
wealthy
range
husbands,
made
and
sense
that
to
the
me,
entire population
but
of women had
melee?
been
What the
ruined
fuck
by
kind
their,
of word
quote,
is that?
Intemperance and luxury.
Or
Unquote.
melee.
To me, intemperance and luxury just sounds like they were having a good time. So the Spartans were ridiculously wealthy, but even after hundreds of years, they still obsessively thought of themselves as foreign occupiers.
Once
In their
my men are in
minds, they were
position, I'm
always
going to
just
lock them into
one
that position
misstep
so that
away
way
from
I
the
can
total destruction
move them
of
around
their
at will
civilization.
as one big block.
For this reason, the Spartans placed an extremely high importance on prophecy and omens. Managing
good
a
enough.
bunch of sometimes
Lock it
contradictory
in.
prophecies can be a full-time job, so
Lock
each
it
king
in.
had 2 attendants to keep track of all of this. If one of the kings had a question for one of the oracles
Turn
in the
off
region,
skirmish,
such as
put
the
on guard
Oracle
mode.
of Delphi or Delphi, they would send one of these attendants to go and ask it for them. So, in a sense, the kings were the chief religious officials in the city. Their presence served as a religious justification for the city's continued existence, which was central to Spartan religious life. But in a practical sense, the city continued to exist because of Sparta's incredible military prowess. Strictly speaking, the kings were the only 2 people.
I don't know if
allowed
you're
to
interested in
lead
history, but
Sparta's
I fucking
armies.
love history.
While one of the kings was on campaign, he basically transformed into an absolute monarch. His word was law.
He held life and death power over every Spartan citizen, and could even confiscate property if he deemed it necessary for the war effort. The Spartan kings were entitled to a portion of everything that was captured in battle, but this didn't necessarily make them super wealthy. Being king was an expensive job. As I said before, the kings regularly, you might even say compulsively, consulted with oracles. When doing this, the kings were expected to make a king-sized donation to the host temple. To shortchange the temple would be to directly insult that temple's god. This was unthinkable to the superstitious Spartans.
Okay, hurry up and fucking fire.
The
There we
kings
go.
had another massive expense, often overlooked. When on campaign, they had to bring some of their personal livestock with them to make animal sacrifices
Their
before
entire
virtually
army
every
is
important
fucking
decision.
monsters.
If after the
you
sacrifice
fucking
the
kidding
omens
me?
were still bad, the king had to continue making sacrifices until the omens changed. Slaughtering this many animals meant that while on campaign, the kings would just be hemorrhaging money. Animal sacrifices became so frequent that at one point, to ensure that the kings never ran out, there was a law passed that said that one piglet from every litter had to be taken and added to the king's personal livestock. That's an insane number of pigs. I mentioned a law being passed. The kings had nothing to do with that. Their jobs were religious and military, and that's it. Governance was left to others. The people in Sparta who actually wrote the legislation were called the Ephors. Their name translates
Fucking
as
heifers.
something like the overseers, and why the Spartans called them that will become clear in a minute.
As soon as these
Sparta
guys come into
had
range, I'm
5
fucking bombarding
Ephors,
them.
each at least 45 years old.
Okay, I'm
and
not
each
wasting
elected
my
for a 1-year term.
artillery on these guys. Fuck
Once
that.
an Ephor had served his term, he was barred from ever serving again. I
This is
say
a great
elected,
system, by the
but
way.
it was more complicated than that. We don't have a complete picture of exactly how this worked, but from what we can tell, the Spartans popularly elected an unknown number of candidates, and then 5 of those elected were chosen at random to serve as Ephors for that
Horns,
year.
flags, and whistles.
In other words, we know that the selection process was randomized to a degree, but we don't know to what degree. Were there 10 candidates to choose from, or 100? We have no idea. Aristotle says that this office usually went to relatively poor Spartans, and if that's true, there may have been a lot of randomness at play. At the beginning of the Spartan New Year, when the Ephors assumed office, they immediately renewed Sparta's war against the Helots in an elaborate ceremony. The whole thing served as a reminder to all Spartans that they were not native to this land, and that in theory, they were in a state of perpetual warfare
Drums, horns,
against their
whatever.
own slaves. In practice, the Spartans used this state of war to justify all sorts of atrocities toward the Helot population, who, from what we can tell, did nothing to deserve any of it. I would encourage you to go and look some of this stuff up. It's chilling. So on their first day, the Ephors singled out the Helots. What did they do for the rest of the year? What did they oversee? They oversaw the kings.
Okay, there we go. There we go.
At the beginning of each new month, the 2 kings and the 5 Ephors would get together and exchange the following oaths. The kings would say to the Ephors, "I will reign according to the established laws of the state." And the Ephors would answer, "While you abide by your oath, we will keep the kingship unshaken." Kingship unshaken, what does that mean? The Ephors had an incredible amount of power to exercise oversight. If the king was acting in a way they didn't like, they could hold a vote.
Okay, so I'm
and
gonna
with
have
a
my
straight
archers back
majority of
up.
3-2, they could formally charge a king with a crime. If a king was charged, there would be a trial. The Ephors were responsible for collecting and presenting the evidence, and then they would join forces with
The
another
little
body
drummer
called
boy,
the
yes,
Gerousia
yes.
to serve together as a jury. I'll talk about them later. If a king was found guilty, a bunch of things could happen. On one end of the spectrum, he could be fined, and on the other, he could be stripped of the crown and banished from Sparta. In the case of banishment, the crown simply passed to the next in line to the throne. Remember, according to the Spartans, Heracles himself had given their kings the right to rule this land. Removing a king was bad enough, but they would never upset the line of succession. But the removal of a king was a rare occurrence. Even if a king was stuck with a group of hostile Effers, they were going to be gone in a year. The kings would have been savvy enough to know when to keep a low profile and wait for their enemies to leave office. But during wartime, the kings couldn't hide. They needed to be out, leading Sparta's armies. And when they were on campaign, 2 Effers went with them. 2 is an important number here. 2 Effers couldn't do anything on their own. They couldn't charge the king with a crime or interfere in any way with the conduct of the war, but they could take notes and report to the Effers back home what they saw. Once hostilities had ceased, together they could decide if the king had overstepped his bounds. But during normal stretches of time, when Sparta was not at war, the Effers spent most of their time writing policy. Simple votes were taken between the 5 Effers, and with a simple majority of 3, a proposal was approved. There were virtually no constraints on what they could dream up, but just because something got the approval of the Effers didn't mean that it became law. There was a mechanism for that, and we'll cover it later. Debates about taxes and spending obviously took up a lot of their time, but so did basic rules about
I'm absolutely going
Spartan
to
lifestyle. Once the Effers agreed on a piece of legislation, they would present it before an assembly of all male Spartan citizens. Once they heard the proposal, the Spartans would verbally vote yay or nay. No amendments, no discussion, just yay or nay. So if you want to summarize what we have so far, the 2 kings served as Sparta's religious figureheads and military leaders, while the 5 Effers provided oversight and passed legislation with the consent of the people. There were also a bunch of smaller things that the Effers had control over. They got to decide who was allowed into and out of Spartan territory. This included merchants and diplomats and curious writers like Xenophon, whose work was crucial in the research for this video.
Okay, so
Xenophon was able to live in Sparta for several years, striking up a close friendship with one of the kings. But even for Xenophon, his future in Sparta was always uncertain. Every year, new Effers came to power, and every year they re-evaluated whether or not they would allow this foreigner to live in their
Now we're going
midst.
to push these guys forward. Since I'm using the Roman system of combat, I've noticed a very nice thing with it, where every unit is independent.
Spartans had a reputation for going
it's not a solid front line that if it breaks...
We're talking out of control drinking, gambling, whoring,
with the Roman system, every unit can do something.
Good at living under their
I learned this on my own through playing it,
but once they were out on their own, anything was up for grabs. What else did the Effers do? Well, they took an active role in the education of children. When a group of boys graduated into adulthood, the Effers picked 3 from the graduating class who, in their opinion, had outperformed their peers and best exemplified Spartan values. These 3
so the Roman checkerboard
were
system,
allowed to pick 100 of their peers.
I'm gonna actually line up my guys. I'm gonna tell them to move out. So let's just set them all to move forward.
Boys selected by the
nice checkerboard, although it's damaged as shit right now.
Became their subordinates.
The Roman system,
together,
what it was they, when they lined up for battle, most armies at the time were basically just a long line of a bunch of big hairy dudes that smelled bad. The Romans had a bunch of clean-shaven dudes that smelled bad, aligned in a checkerboard formation. These checkerboards allowed them to have multiple lines deep, but the gap allowed them to fill it as needed.
The randomized selection process,
if you needed to suddenly have one forward,
could have
you could.
introduced a lot
Bam,
of instability
done.
into the Spartan system. But this
really
review
fucking
mechanism
useful.
Discouraged the Effers from
So you could
trying
have
anything
a
too radical,
solid line
maybe to a fault.
with reinforcements,
Every
or you could
surviving
fall
account
back.
of the Effers is missing something
You could
important.
also immediately
There are no
turn
stories of
and
any
face a
significant
flanker
legislative accomplishments.
just by a rotation of
That's
one
weird.
unit. Every unit is
There could be a
independent,
few reasons for this.
while at the same time
Maybe
putting up a
everybody was
solid
scared of
defense.
this
It was
formal
fucking
review
brilliant.
process at the end of the year. Or maybe it happened, but nobody was
So
there
let's say
to
I had
write it down.
cavalry coming at me.
As it is, our
This unit
sources
here,
are super patchy, and the
I can
only
turn it
reason
around
we know
on a
half
dime,
of this
without
stuff
turning
is
around my
because
entire line.
Xenophon happened to be pals with one of the kings. Or maybe the Effers were constrained.
Unlike
by an
most
external
things where if your line is fucking surrounded, you're screwed.
That brings us to the Gerousia. The Gerousia provided a check on the power of the Effers, which we'll get into in a minute. Geruzia means something like the Council of Elders, and it was made up of 28 members.
I don't know if that video's
The
too
two
loud. It
kings
might be a
were
little bit
also
loud.
honorary members, bringing its official number up to 30. Apart from the two kings, members of the
Yeah,
Geruzia
Roman combat,
met
like this is
at
from
the
what
age
I've
of 60
experienced.
and were expected to be
If they had
well
archers, they would have been
and
unstoppable.
accomplishment. In practice, they seemed to
Like,
all
they didn't,
belong to the
well,
same
they
small
kind of
circle
had ranged
wealthy,
troops, but they were
well-connected
more
families.
dudes throwing spears and then
This
falling
was an
back. They were
elected position,
skirmishers.
But unlike the Effers, these ones were held for life. When a member died, there seems to have been an intense competition for the open spot. It's hard to be certain, but some scholars believe that political factions rose up around the two royal houses, and that each faction jockeyed to get their candidate elected. So, what did the Geruzia do? This body was allowed to set aside any decision that was approved by the assembly of Spartan citizens. In other words, they had veto power. The Effers could write the legislation, the Spartan citizens could approve it, and at the last minute, the Geruzia could step in and be like, no,
Oh,
we're good."
Billy.
They could even take it one step further. The Geruzia set the agenda for every meeting of the assembly, which meant that the Effers could have all of this
How many
lovely
armies are here?
legislation written, and all the Geruzia had to do was say, no, that's not going on the schedule. Since the Effers only served for 1 year, the Geruzia could easily block them until a new batch was elected. Imagine the Geruzia had a significant
I'm gonna
conservative
heavily
influence
leverage
on
my
political
archers here.
culture.
I'm gonna actually use my archers on my front line.
Unless the Geruzia was on board. When an assembly of Spartan citizens were voting, the Geruzia had a super weird job. Members of the Geruzia would sit in another building, not far from the proceedings.
I don't know how well this is gonna go since I'm attacking a city,
Their
but
legislation, and the people would vote on it. Again, voting was done verbally. The Geruzia, sitting a short distance away, could not see what was going on, but they could hear the voting. After the vote, the Geruzia would come forward and announce which side was louder. The louder side won the vote. The idea was that this would keep the Geruzia impartial, but I mean, they were still allowed to veto the results if they didn't like them. As I mentioned before, if a king was on trial,
like
or a
my
citizen
men are
was
too
on trial
badly
for a
damaged.
serious crime, like murder, the Effers and the Geruzia joined forces to form a 35-person jury. Presumably, since the kings were honorary members of the Geruzia,
Like,
they
way
got
too
to
fucking
elect a
damaged.
jury to their own trial. Weird. A simple majority decided the result, and since the elected members of the Geruzia held 28 of the 35 seats,
I'm gonna lose some of them, which is unfortunate because those are really experienced troops.
just in case anything they did ever went to trial, the kings liked to informally consult with the Geruzia before any major decision. It made the old men feel important, and if the Effers ever decided to come after the king, it was
I'm sending these
he had acted
badly
without
damaged
his
troops off the
consent.
field. There's no reason for them to
Sparta
be
was
there.
a notoriously cautious
They're
and
really experienced, and I don't want to
conservative
lose
state,
them
and
because
it's
they will
believed
regrow.
that the Geruzia was the primary institutional source of that caution. Writing centuries after Sparta's
Okay, let's see.
the Roman politician Cicero, you know, that guy, heaped praise upon the Spartan system. He liked how the kings were always hyper-aware that they could be removed from office at a moment's notice. He liked how the
I'm gonna
Effers had to
force my
justify
archers
all
up
their actions
forward.
to their successors at the end of their term. He liked how powerful the Geruzia was, and how these wise old men could balance competing interests or shut down legislation if things were getting out of hand. He thought that this was an incredibly stable way to build institutions, and as a conservative, Cicero loved stability. Xenophon agreed, calling Spartan institutions and the stability they provided the source of its strength. But in the end, maybe it was too stable. At the
Alright,
height of its
let's
power,
have my
Sparta
king
was able to
charge
mobilize
straight
its
forward
entire male citizenry
and have
to an
him
army
take
of
out
at least
these
20,000,
gates.
maybe more. 150 years later in Alexander the
Right?
Great, this number had shrunk to 1,000 men for unknown reasons.
Spartan society was
Alexander the Great's father, Philip, felt
everything we
confident
need
of Spartan
right
plans.
now.
150 years after that, when when the Romans started getting their hands dirty in Greece, Sparta was nothing more than an insignificant village, a curiosity, still living under kings and ephors and the Gerousia, and still observing their strict ancient customs. The causes of this precipitous decline are not known to us. Over the course of
you hit that wall.
Years,
You hit that wall. You're gonna reinforce right there. You're gonna reinforce right here. You three are gonna hit this gate. Go forward.
Slaves. Maybe they could have relaxed their strict marriage laws. You know, reforms, ideas, solve the problem. This is what governments are for. Despite their worst fears, the Spartan invaders were never overthrown by a Helot uprising or by a coalition of angry Greeks. Instead, they allowed themselves to wither and atrophy, only to be conquered by another set of invaders who saw them as nothing more than a bunch of archaic freaks left over from a more illustrious time.
Gonna have those two take that out. Actually, no. I'm gonna have my artillery take out these towers because they're causing me some issues. No I'm not. No I'm not. As soon as I start attacking that, I won't be able to climb that wall. So I've wasted all that ammo. Oh shit. Halt. Toggle skirmish. Fuck off. Fire at will. Hold. Okay, fire.
In the 6th century BCE, the city of Athens implemented some of the most significant political
You're gonna love this
reforms
one,
in world
Nix,
history.
if you like history.
These reforms eventually produced a system called democracy, and this innovation forever changed political theory. But before we get there, we need a bit of context. The constitutional history of ancient Athens, or at least the important bits, can be easily divided into 3 distinct eras. First, Athens was an oligarchy, which means that a small group of powerful families ruled the city. In time, Athens underwent a radical transformation and became what I'm going to call a limited democracy.
Yep.
Roughly a
Hello.
century later,
What's up?
Athens changed yet again from a limited democracy to a full democracy. Although even at the height of Athenian democracy, political rights were not extended to women, or children, or slaves, or foreign residents, who together made up like 90% of the Athenian population. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's begin back during the oligarchy. During this period, a small council called the Areopagus was at the center of Athenian political life.
Just straight charge.
You can kind of think of the Areopagus as a senate or a council of elders, only way more exclusive. Membership tended to be based on birth, which meant that all political activity was limited to a few powerful families. The poor were basically ignored. This council was responsible for political appointments, and surprise, surprise, these tended to go to friends and family. In the early years, political appointees served for life, but over time this was reduced
I need these
to
archers
10-year
on these
terms,
walls.
and even later
Get
to
up there.
1-year terms.
Climb the walls.
There were 3 important political appointees. The first was called the Basileus, which just means king. To be clear, this person wasn't really the king. This was just a throwback title, left over from an old, forgotten monarchy. The Basileus officiated religious festivals and performed important sacrifices.
I don't know very
The
much about
symbolic
Napoleon,
connection to the
surprisingly.
old monarchy made this a prestigious position, even though politically it was virtually powerless. The second appointee was called the Polemarch, which means war leader. This person was the commander-in-chief of the Athenian military, which was obviously a big and important job. The Polemarch also had a minor role in Athenian religious life, and would participate in any war-related festivals or ceremonies. The third position was known as the eponymous archon. Historians attach the word eponymous to this name simply because the Athenians, like many other ancient states, named their years after the person in charge. The eponymous archon, or just archon, was the city's chief government official. They stood at the head of the government bureaucracy and administered the Athenian state. Obviously, this was the most important position in Athens. There were also 6 less important positions called Junior Archons. It's confusing, so we don't have to get into it, but every public official was technically an Archon, which meant that people sometimes called them the 9 Archons of Athens. Today we just call the most important public official the Archon. The Junior Archons aren't really important, they just helped out with the legal system. The only reason I mention them is because they'll come up later, but I mean, don't worry about it. So that's our baseline,
Get behind,
the 9
we're slipping.
Archons of Athens. As we move away from the oligarchy and towards democracy, the most important thing to remember is that the 3 major positions, the
use the fucking bows and shoot.
The Archon, were all appointed by the Areopagus. In the early 6th century BCE, there was a prolonged political dispute within the Areopagus, and all public business ground to a halt. As a solution, the oligarchs found a compromise candidate to serve as Archon, and empowered him to implement a series of reforms to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. This man's name was Solon, and in time, his reforms would help produce the world's first full democracy.
I don't know much. You're just gonna have to listen and learn.
Solon came to office with
I've only heard the video once.
He believed that the way to stop the infighting between the oligarchs was to basically invent politics on a national scale. Solon's theory was that if he could empower the poor and get them involved in the political process, paralysis at the upper levels of power would become impossible. So, for the first time ever, Solon opened up Athenian politics to every adult male citizen. He did this by establishing an assembly of Athenian citizens. From this point forward, this assembly was at the center of Athenian politics. Virtually every government decision ran through the assembly, from military procurement to diplomatic relations to declarations of war. The world had never seen anything like this.
Yeah, I need these guys out of the city. Just retreat. I'm retreating out all my infantry. I'm gonna let the archers take it out.
A minimum of 6,000 citizens had to be present before a vote in the assembly could take place. From what we can tell, tens of thousands showed up on a regular basis to make their voices heard. Before the voting, any relevant speakers were invited onto a stage to make their case before the crowd. Voting was done by a show of hands, and it's important to recognize that there was no secret ballot. Everybody knew how their friends and neighbors were voting, and they weren't shy about telling them if they disapproved. By the way, in Athens there was no such thing as an ironic detachment from politics. Good citizens had strong political opinions. This level of public engagement is what people mean when they say Athenian democracy, and there's never quite been anything like it. But it's not like the old oligarchs gave up all of their power. Solon set up a new council, separate from the Areopagus, called the Bull. This
you know what? Fuck it. I don't actually care if I lose all those elite units. I need to take this fucking city.
For a vote. With all of its legislative authority taken away, the old Areopagus was left with virtually no power. I want to talk about how this council was organized, but first I need to quickly explain how Solon reformed the Athenian class structure. He divided all Athenian citizens into 4 economic classes. For our purposes today, all we need to know is that these classes were basically the ultra-rich, the very rich, the moderately rich, and everybody else. So, Solon used these 4 classes to inform the makeup of his new council, allowing each class to appoint 100 men to the Bull. The fact that 300 of the 400 members were appointed by rich people was by design. Make no mistake, this was aristocracy by another name. We don't exactly know how people got appointed to the council, but it's safe to assume that each class held some sort of internal election. Speaking of elections, the 9 Archons of Athens were no longer appointed by the Areopagus, and were instead elected by the people. Each of the 4 economic classes held its own election. Poor Athenians couldn't be candidates themselves, but they could vote for rich people who aligned with their interests. The 10 candidates from each class with the most votes were all mixed together into one group of 40. Of these 40 candidates, 9 names were picked at random, and these people became the Basilius, the Polemarch, the Eponymous Archon, and the 6 Junior Archons. Again, this system was stacked in favor of the rich, but it was a step in the right direction. At the time, the Athenians justified the randomness
I can kill this
in
fucking
selections
leader.
with
I
piety,
swear to
saying
God.
that they always liked to give the final say to the gods. In practice, this was a pretty simple way to reduce the influence of money in politics, since no amount of bribery could ever guarantee a result. Under this new democracy, Athenian politics flourished. Pretty quickly, three major factions emerged, each vying for power. First, there was the Plains faction. These people tended to be rich landowners who lived on the plains outside the city. The Plains faction were the remnants of the old landed aristocracy. Consequently, they fought to preserve the prerogatives of the rich and opposed any further political reforms. As landowners, they worked to protect their profits by opposing any initiatives that would lower the price of food. Next, there was the Hill faction. People in the Hill faction lived on the hills in and around the city. The hills were pretty lousy places to live, since you couldn't really farm or build on them very much. This faction consisted of the poorest citizens, who
that
up until recently had been locked out
oh my God,
of the
I've lost
process.
fucking everything.
They loved the political reforms, and favored any initiatives that would further improve their standard of living. Obviously, the Plains faction and the Hill faction did not like each other. The third faction was the Coast faction. The area near the coast was a bustling economic zone, full of artisans and manufacturing and lots of trade. This faction included both rich and poor citizens, but what united them was that their livelihoods depended on trade with the outside world. The Coast faction was cosmopolitan and
goddamn fucking
but
trolls.
They were interested in making money. In order to get the Coast faction on board with the new Athenian democracy, Solon offered Athenian citizenship to any foreign-born, skilled professional that wanted to move to the city with their family. The Coast faction loved this policy, and it helped propel Athens into an economic boom. But, as I've said, Athens wasn't a full democracy yet. The system was still institutionally biased towards the rich, which over time created a bunch of unforeseen problems. The three factions hated each other, and it was increasingly difficult to get anything accomplished. Also, despite the safeguards built into the system, a series of strongmen found it easy to get themselves elected archon and seize power. Athens entered a brief period of tyranny.
Oh, I won by virtue of holding the point,
were thrown out of the city,
but I lost my
and another
entire
set of
army.
reforms
That
were
was
implemented,
the
transforming
definition of
Athens
a
from
Pyrrhic
limited
victory.
democracy to a full democracy. This new system was a significant improvement and fixed a lot of the old problems. Most importantly, it dealt with the persistent factional gridlock. As a first step, the old class system was thrown out the window. In its place, 10 new artificial groups were created, called tribes. Each tribe covered a certain geographic area, and each was deliberately designed so that all three political factions had equal representation within each tribe. Again, the purpose of these tribes was to stop the gridlock. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Athens was further subdivided into 139 demos, or deme, each belonging to a specific tribe. Each deme had its own council, which was led by an elected official called a demarch. The demarch, along with the council, could pass little bylaws and raise its own revenue as needed. This was a pretty ingenious invention. Over time, each citizen's political identity became intertwined with their deme. We even have evidence that some people started replacing their family name with their deme name.
Neat.
Now that the old wealth-based classes were gone, the boule had to be completely restructured. Membership was increased from 400 to 500, and from now on, each of the 10 tribes got to elect 50 people to the council. This time, there was no institutional bias toward the wealthy. Elections were run locally, so each deme got to choose a handful of their own candidates. All candidates from the same tribe were pooled together, and 50 were selected at random to represent their tribe in the boule for that year. Citizens were only allowed to serve in the Bull twice in their lifetime, with a mandatory 10-year gap in between terms. With these limitations, any ambitious citizen had a pretty good shot at getting elected at some point in their life. As before, the Bull prepared the agenda for each meeting of the Athenian Assembly. However, this new and improved Bull was even more powerful than before, and most of that had to do with a new mechanism called the Prytaneus.
Let's see, what do I want to do?
The Prytaneus was basically an executive committee within the Bull. The 360-day Athenian calendar year was evenly divided into 10 parts. For 36 days a year, each tribal delegation got to serve on the Prytaneus, which was responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the Athenian state. If the Athenian Assembly decided to build some ships, this committee got the money and hired the shipbuilders. If public employees needed to get paid, this committee figured out how to get the money into their hands. If a foreign diplomat needed to speak with the Athenian government, they spoke with this committee. To put it very simply, this committee ran the government. During those 36 days, all 50 members of the Prytaneus lived together in a house in the center of Athens. The committee worked 24 hours a day in shifts. Just in case there was ever an emergency, there was a rule that 17 members had to be on duty at all times. Every day, one person was chosen at random to serve as chairman of the committee. The chairman was in charge of the state seal, the key to the state treasury, and the key to the state archives. It was a symbolic thing to serve as chairman, but people still considered it an honor. So, the Bull was more powerful than ever, but that had to come at the expense of something else. Gradually, all 9 of the archons became less and less important. Eventually, they became so weak that the duties of each archon were performed by a series of randomly selected Athenian citizens. The fact that the Polemarch, who was in charge of the Athenian military, was now a randomly selected citizen should raise some eyebrows. Luckily, even though the Polemarch was still technically in charge of the military, he was relegated to ceremonial duties, and new positions rose up to do the heavy lifting. Each of the 10 tribes elected somebody called a strategos. Strategos basically means general, and together the strategoi commanded the Athenian armies and admiraled her fleets. But just as importantly, they were instrumental when crafting military policy. When the assembly was debating anything warfare related, it was customary to invite all 10 strategoi to give their opinion. Sometimes there were lively debates back and forth, but when there was a consensus among the strategoi, the assembly tended to defer to their expertise. Strictly speaking, each strategos was only supposed to serve for 1 year, but the assembly wasn't afraid to extend their term, especially during wartime.
I just got 10 turns of 25% physical resistance against an all-physical army.
A lot of care was taken to make sure that Athenian politics wouldn't fall into factionalism and infighting like it did back in the old days. A lot of progress had been made on this front. The tribes were non-ideological, and each tribe was given its turn to be in charge of the Bull's executive committee. But weak factions still sometimes rose up around specific issues, and there was always the danger that one of these days, this could produce another tyrant. To prevent this, the Athenians built a release valve into their system. This release valve was called ostracism. Once per year, there was a special assembly meeting. Unlike every other meeting, when people arrived, they grabbed a smashed piece of pottery that was provided for them. Each citizen used this pottery as a makeshift ballot and etched a name into the surface. The names were tallied, and if one name received more than 6,000 votes, the person with the most votes was ostracized or banished from the city for a period of 10 years. There was no need for any proof of wrongdoing or criminality or anything. To put it quite simply, when an ostracism went into effect, the most unpopular person in Athens, usually a politician, was expelled from the city. This was a crude but effective way to fight against the emergence of both strongmen and factionalism. If a minority of citizens could get anybody banished from the city, it was tough to get a divisive political movement off the ground. The vote took place every year, but that didn't necessarily mean that somebody was banished every year. If no one individual received 6,000 votes, no action was taken.
Alright, let's see what I want to go
As full Athenian democracy was implemented, the city ballooned into a manufacturing powerhouse, exporting its products and its culture all over the Mediterranean. It didn't take long for the Athenians to develop a reputation for their unique political system, and for the city itself to become a major hub for political thinkers. From Italy to North Africa to the Near East, cities began to adopt political institutions that looked an awful lot like the Athenian ones. After centuries in the sun, Athens was eventually conquered by outside powers, but the example they set and their contribution to Western political thought continues to be one of the most important things that any state has ever produced.
Man. Now we're going to learn about Macedonian battle tactics.
Geopolitically, Alexander the Great was born on third base. Before he ascended to the throne, his father, Philip, had already achieved the impossible by extending Macedonian influence over the entire Greek peninsula. And his father's influence didn't stop at geopolitics. Philip spent his entire career working to improve the Macedonian military. When Philip died, Alexander inherited the finest army on the planet. So let's talk about the Macedonian military. There's no better place to start than with their cavalry. The Macedonians called their cavalry the companions, or the companion cavalry. During this period, most Western armies had a really narrow conception of the proper use of cavalry. Many trained them to harass the enemy by throwing javelins or shooting arrows. Others used them as scouts or skirmishers. But beyond that, their use was limited. The Macedonians ignored this conventional wisdom. The companion cavalry specialized in charging the enemy flanks and inflicting massive casualties up close with their swords and spears. Despite what the movies may tell you, this was rare in the ancient world. You could even say that it was unintuitive. Stirrups hadn't been invented yet, and many people, including the Macedonians, didn't even use saddles. A person could get knocked off their horse by a stiff breeze. To many, charging straight into a mass of humanity seemed suicidal. But the Macedonians knew what they were doing. For instance, the spears they used were quite interesting. They were made to be as light and as thin as possible, so thin that the wooden spear wobbled as they charged. They were about 12 feet long and were held near the center. Both ends of the spear had metal tips, so if one end broke, all the rider had to do was flip the spear around and continue fighting with the other end. If that end broke as well, they had a sword to use as backup. Obviously, these spears weren't designed to crash into the enemy line. That would have shattered the spear and knocked the rider off the horse. The spear was designed to make lightning-quick stabs while on the move. This was hard to do, but the companions were expertly trained and were quite deadly with them. So all of this made the companions pretty distinct in the ancient world, but they also organized themselves in a strange way. When they charged, they didn't do it in a line like you'd think. They charged as a wedge. There's a reason for this. When cavalry charges in a line, they have a tendency to do this.
They spread out, is what he's saying.
When the Macedonian wedges charged, they could do this.
They did a turning maneuver where they can maneuver the entire line at once. The wedge
was the guy in charge. Since everyone could keep an eye on their leader, the entire unit could basically receive orders non-verbally. This meant that they could wordlessly change directions mid-gallop, or specifically target vulnerable enemy units with surgical accuracy. When they made contact with the enemy, any opening made by the riders at the front could immediately be exploited by the riders further back. As a result, the wedges were capable of creating chaos and cutting deep into the enemy line. A well-timed charge like this could single-handedly win a battle. But no matter how successful the cavalry were, the opportunities they created needed to be followed up by infantry. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For this to make sense, we need a rock-solid understanding of what a phalanx was. If we're talking phalanxes, we're talking spears. Dudes holding spears maybe 8 feet long, with big circular shields. A phalanx was a group of these spearmen organized into a tight square. In battle, they presented a solid shield wall, bristling with spears. Since there were so many people packed into the square, and everybody in the square was so well trained, the phalanxes had an intense forward momentum. Against less disciplined opponents,
put all my
they were
artillery on
nearly
this side.
unstoppable. But they had vulnerabilities. They were slow as hell, both slow to move and slow to turn. Plus, since the entire phalanx had to work together, they were pretty bad at fighting in 2 directions at once. This made them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. When 2 opposing phalanxes met on the battlefield, the 2 squares would lock shields and push against each other as hard as they could. This would basically take both of the phalanxes out of commission for a while, and the shoving would continue until one side lost their footing, or another group showed up to tip the balance. Phalanxes were all the rage in Greece. For the century or 2 preceding Philip's reign, the entire peninsula was basically going through one giant phalanx arms race. For the longest time, Macedon didn't have phalanxes. The Macedonians were able to survive on the strength of their excellent cavalry, but the infantry side of things was kind of ignored. When Philip came to power, he busied himself with a bunch of reforms and introduced phalanxes to Macedon. He gave these new units a new prestigious name, the Foot Companions.
Let's set up 3 units over here.
Through Philip's leadership, they would
Just to
become the
fucking
backbone
slaughter
of the
them.
Macedonian army. The Foot Companions were modeled
Now I'll
after
set up
the
all
Greek
my
phalanx,
archers.
but were new and improved. They used a new kind of spear called the sarissa. Technically, sarisses might be pikes rather than spears, but whatever. Let's not be sticklers to detail. This weapon was usually 14
Can I have
or 18
all my
or
archers look
sometimes
over
even
the
20 feet
reinforcements
long.
area?
It was basically twice as long as the spears they used in Greece. So what did this mean? Well, if you can picture
should be
2
nice and easy.
phalanxes marching at each other, the one with the longer spears would always draw
That'll be
first
group 1.
blood, and would therefore have the advantage.
2.
Plus, the sarissas were so long that people 3 or 4 or 5 rows back could still reach the enemy with their spears. If you compare this with the Greek phalanx, the Macedonians were able to get double or triple the number of spears attacking at once, with no additional manpower. But the sarissas came with a downside. They were absurdly long, and it took an equally absurd amount of training to be able to use them effectively. Unlike normal spears, the sarissas had to be held with both hands. To accommodate this, the Macedonians shrunk down their shields and made them into tiny 18-inch bucklers, which could be strapped to each man's upper arm and used to deflect incoming spears. To get the untrained Macedonian infantry comfortable with this new weapon, they had to be drilled and drilled and drilled at a huge cost, but in the end it was worth it. Once they were in the field, the Foot Companions were basically elite phalanxes. Better trained
Let's see
and
how
better
this goes.
equipped than their Greek
So I have all my
counterparts.
thunderers over here.
But
They're
all
just
of the
gonna
training in the world
gun
couldn't
down
change
whatever the
the
fuck
fact
comes from
that
over
it
here.
was incredibly
This is
hard
where the main
for all
army is, but the main
phalanxes,
army, as far as I
including these
remember,
new Foot
is a steaming
Companions,
pile of
to
shit.
respond
The
quickly
reinforcement
to a
army over
changing
here
battlefield.
is
They
going
still
to,
had all of the weaknesses of
quite
a normal
frankly,
phalanx.
fucking hurt.
They were still slow and still vulnerable to getting flanked. When a bunch of phalanxes
So I
were
set up my
lined
guys in a
the
staggered
units
checkerboard
at each
formation,
end of the line
so
were
that way
exposed.
each one will
Here,
eat
Philip
1 or
placed
2
a new
units,
kind of
and then I can
infantry
move forward and
called
flank.
the shield bearers.
So they'll move up like that and around.
The
If I
shield
have an entire
bearers
thick
were outfitted in a
line,
much
I'm
more
fighting 2,
traditional
3,
Greek
4 units
style,
at once with
a
1 unit
shorter,
here,
more
and it's just
manageable
not smart.
spear and a large shield. They also carried swords. Since they weren't weighed down with the giant unwieldy sarissa, the shield bearers were
Actually.
much more versatile than the Foot Companions. They were the Macedonian army's utility players. They could fight as a regular phalanx,
Let's
or they
move
could spread
my
out.
archers around a
They
little
could
bit. There we go.
quickly
Now I get things
redeploy
from
on
both
the
sides.
battlefield, or totally break formation and charge. They could fight with a spear or with a sword. If you ever hear about the Macedonians doing anything weird, like fighting on uneven ground, or breaching walls, or scaling cliffs, it was the shield bearers who did it. These units were entirely made up of veteran
Yeah, look at this
soldiers,
fucking garbage-ass
men
army.
with long
I'm just gonna
and
slaughter this
distinguished
with my
careers, plucked
guns.
from the foot companions and given a place of honor on the flanks.
First things first.
Under
Set
normal
these to
circumstances,
not run
these
away.
units were supposed to hold back and leave the intense fighting to the foot companions. The shield bearers were kind of like a reserve force.
Hold your ground.
Except Philip's innovation was to put his reserves
Don't
on
run
the
away.
exposed flanks, which is kind of genius.
Hold your ground.
When the enemy line began to falter, the shield bearers were sent in. They could move much faster than the foot companions, and their looser way of fighting was better for dealing with a retreating enemy. Now all of the pieces are in place. Let's see how they worked together.
I forgot to move my fucking dude over.
The most well-known Macedonian tactic is called the hammer and anvil. You may have heard of this. It's super famous. With the hammer and anvil, it was the infantry's job, in this case the foot companions, to engage the enemy and hold them in place. They were the anvil. It was the cavalry's job to swing around and attack the enemy from behind. They were the hammer. The whole thing relied on the speed and effectiveness of the hammer, and the reliability of the anvil. The whole point of this tactic was to quickly envelop the enemy
and
force
slaughter
them
them
to
immediately.
face attacks from two directions at once. If the enemy wanted to break the encirclement, they either had to go through the foot companions, who were basically one giant unstoppable meat grinder.
That's fucking
or
annoying.
Go through the companion
Fuck
cavalry,
mages.
who happened to be one of the most effective cavalry units in human history. It's simple, but it's extremely effective. Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae used this tactic against the Romans.
Did you
with
fucking
astounding
seriously just
success,
sneak through
but
that?
We'll cover other
That
famous examples. in the
incredibly small gap.
Before
Fine,
Philip's
I'll
reign,
fucking slaughter you.
Macedon did not have reliable infantry. They were able to get by because of their excellent cavalry, but nobody ever bothered to invest the time and money to bring the infantry up to the Greek standard. Philip changed this. Through his leadership, he not only met the Greek standard, but exceeded it. At the time of his death, Macedon was still a regional
Son of a
power,
bitch.
but thanks to Philip, it could now field a
I got game by the
world-class
game.
army.
Okay, now I need to swing my artillery, hit that. I need you guys here now. Oh, Billy, we're gonna get ass fucked.
Studying the
Get
Roman
that.
fighting style is no simple thing. It spans over 1,000 years, to say nothing of the Byzantines. In the West, if you look at Rome's basic tactical framework in a general way, it can be divided into 3 distinct systems. These systems have remarkably
Okay,
little to do with
so
each other, and
my
were constructed to accomplish
artillery
something very
needs
different.
to hit hard
Actually, it's down to the
and
development
hit
of the
one
system.
spot. Break their
Today, I wanna
fucking
talk about all
line.
3 of these in turn. Let's get started. The phalanx system is the first one that Rome adopted. It came directly from Greece as a result of early Greek influence on the Italian phalanx. A phalanx was a unit of tightly grouped armored spearmen who moved and fought as one. There's a reason why the Greek fighting style was being appropriated by these foreigners. Phalanxes were tough, damned near impossible. They were slow, but once they came
There we
into
go.
contact with the enemy, the combined weight of the entire unit was too much for anybody to handle, unless it was met with another phalanx. So the early Romans straight up stole this fighting technique. They used it with a lot of success against some of their neighbors who fought in a much less organized way. The standard way
Now we're gonna
to
hit this
break
line.
was one giant straight line. Any enemy charging into this would have been met with one giant wall of spears. The early battle would have been pretty lopsided, as Romans just plowed over these
Them completely circumventing my defense by going the long way was not foreseen.
Also, because of the way that everybody had to support the spearmen at the front, they couldn't fight in more than one direction at once.
I don't normally like letting them charge forward, but it's keeping them routed, so.
To protect against any flanking attacks. They could also chase down any faster enemies that the phalanx couldn't catch. For whatever reason, the Romans never really did much of this, but they were successful all the same. This worked for a long time, but it started to get the Romans into trouble as they expanded into central Italy. This area was mountainous, which is not ideal for the slow-moving straight lines of the phalanx. It's hard to keep a line like this perfectly straight as you move up a hill. If you have to move around,
I want everything dead. Actually, you know what? It doesn't even matter.
Which is the perfect time for an enemy.
Oh, it does. Shit. Fuck.
Moreover, the inhabitants of this region were no slouches. They used hit-and-run tactics and lots of projectile weapons. Even when they closed in for hand-to-hand fighting, these were tough mountain men, and they gave the Romans a run for their money. The Romans suffered a string of defeats and began to seriously reevaluate how they fought. Maniples were an ingenious solution to this very specific problem with the phalanx: inflexibility. First of all, maniples were smaller, standalone units. This meant that they were capable of fighting in isolation, or even in several directions at once. A phalanx would usually crumble if it ever got surrounded, whereas a maniple could shift and
This is exactly what I was doing with my units, the way they were.
Instead of arraying themselves in big
a maniple is what it was called.
Maniples arrayed themselves like this, in a checkerboard pattern. This was a fundamental change. Now they didn't have to step out of formation if they ever wanted to go over hilly terrain, or dodge trees and rocks, or cross a stream. The entire formation can kind of flex and bend as necessary, while maintaining its readiness. It wasn't just the formations that changed. Their entire fighting ethos was now different. The solid walls of spearmen were now mostly gone, replaced by men wielding swords and shields. Individual maniples now found themselves in specialized roles. There were three major ones. First, the Histati.
Histati, Principes, and Triarii.
The Histati were always placed at the front of the line, and were the first to come into contact with the enemy. Histati were outfitted with a sword and shield, but also with javelins that the entire unit could throw at a moment's notice. This was a big innovation. The phalanx system had no ranged units, which meant that faster enemy units could stay at a distance if they wanted to. Now, not only were maniples faster, but almost every Roman unit is now a ranged unit. The Histati were always the first
yeah, I took a lot of damage. I went from rank 1st to rank 6th.
And the Histati would swap out with the second line, who were called the Principe. These were older veterans, who were outfitted similarly to the Histati, but with slightly better equipment. Under normal circumstances, these two lines would alternate for the duration of the battle, giving each other a break as needed. In a perfect world, the third line would never be used. These were the Triarii, and they were the oldest veterans. We can think of them as their elite troops. Unlike the Histati and the Principe, the Triarii retained some phalanx-like qualities. They were still spearmen, but were organized more loosely, so that the entire unit wouldn't crumble if they ever broke formation. The Triarii were so rarely used that the Romans had a saying for when something was going badly. They would say, "It's come to the Triarii." I've always liked this saying, because it has a meaning that's kind of unique to Roman culture. It means that the enemy has broken through and this is the last thing that we can do to respond. But it also means there's a major problem and it's time for the real adults to step in and fix this. It's weirdly pragmatic and optimistic. Sometimes an entire campaigning season would go by and the Triarii would only be used once or twice. This made them crazy. We're told that sometimes they were forced to sit on the ground during battle, like children, because they had this reputation for charging in against orders. They sometimes resorted to begging just to be allowed to get into the fight. I looked and couldn't remember.
The real adults, yes.
But years ago I read something saying that a Roman general put his Triarii up front during a battle because he was getting reports that there might be a mutiny if they had to sit this one out. That might be apocryphal, but I swear I saw it somewhere. These were tough dudes.
No, okay. So I'm actually gonna show this. Because you're gonna find this interesting as shit. Add scene. Add display capture. Yeah, good enough. Okay. So look at this. The red units are the Romans.
Something saying that a Roman general put his Triarii
How to see how they're staggered?
Battle because he was getting reports that
see how they have the three lines? So you can move them up, move them up, move them back, swap out if they get tired. Stuff like that. The Roman fighting style was really fucking useful. Too bad I can't field that many units. because I need supporting archers currently. I don't have melee and range units, unlike the Romans who had javelins. Yeah.
To sit this one out. That might be apocryphal, but
it also allows you to hold. Another nice feature about it is that because of all the space, it allows you to take up a whole bunch more room without getting flanked
as easily. Because if you're deep and wide versus just wide, you really can't do anything to that.
There wasn't too many times, except can I? Basically, anything that wasn't Hannibal, the Roman system worked really well. If you don't know what Hannibal did, he... Oh my god. I'll show the video on that later.
These were tough dudes.
Hannibal was disgustingly talented.
Let's go back for a moment to the Battle of the Trebia River. If you
recall, right here, perfect.
The first two Roman lines fully committed, and some in the center were in the process of cutting through the enemy and marching right off the battlefield. These were the Hastati and the Principe. The third line, the Triarii, were held back as usual. When Hannibal's epic surprise attack emerged from the long grass, the Triarii turned, fixed spears, and stopped the attack dead in its tracks. They did their job perfectly and didn't give an inch. It was the younger men up front who panicked and started to give in to the Carthaginians on the wings. These same Triarii were the ones who were last seen getting surrounded, holding their ground and making a heroic last stand as the rest of the Romans were killed, captured, or driven off. I'll say it again, these were tough dudes. Rome used this maniple system for a long time, and Rome eventually rose from being a regional to a global power. But as this was happening, they started to notice some structural issues. The maniple was designed to face off against the hill people in central Italy, and now Romans were fighting from Spain to Asia. A lot of the time, they were now in the position of fighting huge, well-organized armies from rich and powerful kingdoms. Things had changed, and Rome needed to reorganize.
How did they do
The solution that they came up with is called the cohort system. Before any major changes were made, one thing was abundantly clear.
Oh yes, the late Marius.
The maniples were just too damn small now. Against the hill people of central Italy, one maniple here and one maniple there could make all the difference in the world. But now, armies were huge, and a single maniple here or there was kind of irrelevant. As the first thing going into this reform, the size of each unit was quadrupled. Armies went from having 40 maniples to having 10 cohorts. But a cohort wasn't just a giant maniple. They also fundamentally changed how these units operated. The different experience levels and different specializations were completely done away with, and each cohort became more or less identical. The big strategic change that this facilitated was that the army now emphasized mobility. Unlike the maniple system, these soldiers carried around their own gear, set up their own camps, and cooked their own meals. These guys could construct bridges, clear forests, build roads, anything. These new units were designed to be entirely self-sufficient. They needed to be able to ditch their supplies and march off at a moment's notice if they needed to, and they often did. You can see the appeal of this kind of army. When you have guys stationed thousands of kilometers from the capital, in sometimes hostile territory, you don't necessarily want a bunch of specialists. In other words, you don't want to risk having the backbone of your army wiped out during a battle when reinforcements are months away. You want the entire army to be your backbone, if that makes any sense. There were new tactical realities that emerged naturally from this new organizational structure. With these larger cohorts, it was kind of like each army was made up of 10 smaller armies. This meant that the Romans could now do things differently on the battlefield. They could now delegate a lot more authority to sub-commanders, who could use their own initiative. Under this new system, a general could say, take this cohort and hold the line over there and use your own judgment. It's important to emphasize that almost every cohort was identical, which was a radical change. It meant that any individual unit could step in for another one without any disruption. It also meant that if you wanted to supersize an army, all you had to do was add a few extra cohorts. There was never a situation where you'd be thinking, I have way too many Hastati and not enough Triarii. There was no such thing as a lopsided army. Every unit was the same.
They were maniples for a very long time, though. The Marius reforms were rather late.
It's not like one was a natural consequence of the previous one. These were all radically different systems.
Can you stop going off? I don't know why I'm getting mad. I set these alarms.
Above all, Romans were pragmatic. When a thing stopped working, they ditched it, unsentimentally. They adopted the phalanx system to solve a very specific problem, which was that they had some powerful neighbors that already used the phalanx, which was at the time considered unstoppable. They adopted the maniple system to solve another very specific problem, which was that they needed to fight on uneven terrain and respond to hit and run attacks from creative, less organized enemies. The cohort system was adopted to solve yet another very specific problem, which was that they were now fighting larger, more traditional armies in
So,
far-flung
if we were to compare what I'm doing right now to Roman, 2-2.
standardized army, so they invented one.
I'll actually play some other Total War games where I can kind of show off some of these strategies.
That's no small thing. This constant change also meant that for them, failure was an option. Each time they were defeated in a major battle, they made significant
Learn
changes
some
to
history.
their military, and usually for the better. That's a cultural trait that's hard to teach, but it was
Okay,
probably
let's see.
Rome's greatest strength.
What can I do here? I have a raging erection for ancient history,
This video
and I'd be lying if any of the politics I was talking about recently were not me
in the vote for another video
channeling Cicero.
You can do that right now. You can just click the link in the description. The voting is going on as we speak.
It's a good kind of hard-on. It's a loving, tender hard-on.
The command structure of the Roman legion operated with this really beautiful high.
Now you're gonna hear
top
why
down and a
Romans were so
bottom-up
powerful
system.
or so good at
The
combat.
smallest unit in the legion was the Contubernium. This was a group of 8 men. These men ate together, marched together, slept together, not like that, and took care of one shared pack animal together. One of our sources writes about a military tradition where men paired off with another member of their Contubernium. These men would watch each other's backs during battle, go on guard duty together, and if one of them were killed, the other would contact their families and hold a funeral service. This was, in effect, the smallest unit in the Roman army, but it was so informal that we don't even have a name for it. The man in charge of the Contubernium was called the Decanus. Decanus, Dec, leading 8 men. Why not Octanus? Well, the Contubernium actually had 2 hidden members. Servants, or maybe slaves, to help with taking care of the pack animal, patching up equipment, cooking, cleaning, stuff like that. So in some instances like this one, they were counted, but they were non-combatants, and unimportant for our purposes. Going forward, we will not count them. So Decanus led a unit of 8 men, which is part of this bottom-up system. Not a lot of information survives about the Decanus, but we know that they were selected from the Contubernium by the Contubernium. In other words, this wasn't a promotion from an officer, but rather an election by their peers. In practice, the Decanus tended to be the most experienced man in the Contubernium. He helped keep order while on the march and disciplined his men when they got out of line. But in battle, he had no significant tactical role. We need bigger units for that. A century was a group of 80 men, and was the most basic tactical unit that the Romans used during battle. Century, 80 men. Again, it doesn't make sense. Remember how the Contubernium had 8 soldiers and 2, let's call them helpers? Well, that naming inconsistency carries forward. A century consisted of 10 Contubernia, meaning there were 80 soldiers and 20 helpers total. A century was the smallest organizational unit that fought as one. Each had their own standard, their own traditions, and soldiers would openly joke about how certain centuries were better than others. A century was commanded by a centurion. There were 59 centurions per legion, and these were the career officers of the Roman army. This position was very much top-down, because centurions were promoted directly by their superiors, and once promoted they held life and death power over the men in their century. Every centurion had an optio, or second-in-command. These men were in charge of the training and discipline of the century, and could take over for the century if it became necessary. In battle, the centurion led the century at the front, which was actually quite dangerous, while the optio stayed at the back at the opposite corner of the formation.
20%
This was
off
so the
one shot,
centurion
guys.
could, lead, while the optio made sure that the formation was solid, and that nobody ran away during battle. Cohorts consisted of 6 centuries, making them 480 men strong.
Only without the fluff.
There were 10 cohorts in every legion. If generals were moving men around the battlefield, they were moving cohorts.
Each one had its own unique trumpet call, so they could receive orders at a moment's notice without use of messengers. Here's another bottom-up system, and this one is really interesting. There was no dedicated commander of a cohort, but there was an institutionalized command structure. Of the 6 centurions in the cohort, the most experienced centurion would automatically assume command of the entire unit, while the other 5 would fall into subordinate positions and act as advisors to the lead centurion. To be clear, every centurion still commanded their own separate century. It's just that the lead centurion also issued orders to the rest of the cohort. If a lead centurion was transferred or went into retirement or was killed, the roles would automatically shift around, and the next most experienced man would get the job. It's this really unusual system.
Okay, that's already open. Holy shit.
Incredibly important to the Legion, but command had nothing to do with how they governed themselves. Now, everything I said before about cohorts is true, except none of it applies to the first cohort in every legion. The first cohort was always its own unique thing. They consisted of 5 special double-strength sentries. The cohort itself wasn't double-sized, but it had 5 double-strength sentries instead of the normal 6. This meant that the first cohort had 800 men, making it 60% larger than cohorts 2 through 10. Since every centurion in this cohort commanded 160 men rather than 80, they were seen as special. They outranked normal centurions from every other cohort. Transfer into and out of the cohort was a command level decision, which meant that the first cohort, unlike the other ones, was to an extent controlled by the higher ups. Belonging to the first cohort was extremely prestigious, even if you were a low-level grunt. The first cohort hosted the Legion's Eagle Standard, and, in theory, protected the commander of the Legion, which I'll get to in a minute. The person in charge of the
okay, let's see what I can do from here.
Experienced of these 5 super centurions, and was called the Primus Pilus. He was the highest-ranking frontline soldier of the entire Legion. He would sometimes be called up by the commander of the Legion to give his advice and to devise strategy. In this way, he was responsible for representing the views of the rank-and-file centurions to the higher-ups. If the men had a problem, they would go to their centurion, who would go to the Primus Pilus, who would go to the commander of the Legion. There's that bottom-up system again. There are isolated incidents where the Primus Pilus would actually take command of the entire Legion, which just shows how much authority they had over their fellow centurions. Unofficially, this made them the 4th in command of the Legion. The official 3rd in command was someone called the Camp Prefect. They were basically a quartermaster in charge of supplies and construction of the fortified encampment.
So since I have this full strength unit on the walls, I'll let that do things.
This man was also a former Primus Pilus, meaning that he had decades of experience under his belt, and experience leading the supersized first cohort. This was the highest rank available to a career soldier. It never says this explicitly in our sources, but we get the impression that this is a
now we're just gonna move in and crush.
Well suited for a Primus Pilus past their prime. But I don't want to detract from this position. They were appointed by the commander of the Legion, top down, but once in place they were the very embodiment of the institutional memory of the Legion, bottom up. Commanders would come and go, but the old camp prefect would stay put until retirement.
Gonna send my thunderous up on the walls.
Somebody called the military tribune. Get ready, because this one's a little complicated. The military tribune was an elected position.
Can't do
it was
that,
seen as an early step in a political career, normally taken by a young man before they could officially enter the Senate around the age of 30. This meant that military tribunes tended to be sons of senators, or sons of wealthy families aspiring to have their first senator. Aristocratic, but with an eye towards pleasing the voters back home, top down and bottom up. In the old days, there were 6 equal military tribunes. They would take turns commanding the Legion as a form of training. When the army became more professional, this system was done away with. They replaced it with this. 5 of the 6 military tribunes were called thin-striped tribunes, after their clothing. These young men were basically personal secretaries to the commander of the Legion and had no real responsibilities. Their only role was to watch and learn. They had no command authority, no combat ability, and no responsibilities during battle. They were a bit of a joke.
Oh my god, no. Stop. Fucking hell. My artillery is hitting my own men.
One of the 6 military tribunes was called the thick-striped tribune, and these are the important ones. They tended to be sons of respected senators, and were separately elected with actual responsibilities. They were second in command of the Legion, and had the authority to lead men into battle if necessary. They were still young men and inexperienced, but highly respected, unlike their thin-striped counterparts. A broad-striped military tribune could reasonably expect to go on to become a senator. Finally,
are you gonna
we have
fucking
the
kill
commander
everything
of
here?
the Legate. This was a senator appointed by the Senate to command the legion for a specific length of time, very top-down. In all, legions consisted of 5,248 men, including 128 cavalry, 640 decani, 59 optios, 59 centurions of various rank, including the primus pilus, 1 camp prefect, 1 military tribune that matters, and 1 legate. What's really interesting is that the 3 command
legate,
positions
Ricka.
in the legion, the camp prefect, the military tribune, and the legate, represent these 3 different sources of power. The camp prefect represents the professional soldier from the bottom up. The legate represents the will of the Senate from the top down. And the military tribune represents the aristocracy and the people back in Rome, which is a complicated blend of the two. The balancing act that they're trying to pull off here is a really different way of thinking about bureaucracy. One man is appointed, one is elected, and one got there through seniority, and all had very different constituencies to please. But by using this system, the Legion as a functional unit remained dynamic for centuries.
There we go. Didn't lose a single unit. We're good. Occupy. Perfect.
In the summer of the year 60, Julius Caesar,
that's a good
approaching
city.
the end of
Shit.
his term as governor of Hispania Ulterior, returned to Italy. He had spent his time campaigning against the hill people of northern Spain, and for his efforts had been awarded a triumph by the Senate. This was a great honor, but Caesar had even higher ambitions. It took some arm twisting, but he was able to secure a special dispensation from the Senate, allowing him to run for consul 2 years before he was technically old enough to run. This was, strictly speaking, against the rules, but more and more common in the late Republic. So here's Caesar, sitting outside the city of Rome, waiting for the Senate to decide on the date for his triumph. This is when the conservative bloc in the Senate threw a curveball. They lobbied successfully for Caesar's triumph to be pushed back until after the deadline to announce your candidacy for consul. Why does this matter? Because triumphs were for active generals, and active generals were forbidden from entering the city. And if you couldn't enter the city, you couldn't run for consul. Why did they do this? Basically because Caesar was a radical reformer and they didn't like his stupid face. Caesar sent a letter to the Senate being like, okay, it looks like you guys made a scheduling mistake. But here's the thing, everybody knew that he intended to run. Why do you think he got that special dispensation to run early? He had been openly preparing for this campaign. He had actually left Spain early just so he could be back before the deadline. If they had a problem with him running, they shouldn't have given him the dispensation to run early. But if this was simply a scheduling mistake, Caesar was open to working it out. He suggested, how about you just let me declare my candidacy in absentia? The Senate heard his request and harumphed many harumphs. Such a thing just wasn't done, and they had already gone out of their way to bend the rules for Caesar. The conservatives, led by a senator named Cato, had a field day with this. Cato filibustered, meaning that he spoke and spoke until the Senate was forced to adjourn for the day. No decision was taken on Caesar's request. Okay, message received. Obviously this wasn't a mistake, this was sabotage. Coincidentally, Cato's son-in-law, Bibulus, was running for consul as well, with the full support of the
Oh
conservative.
shit, that was an ally.
Okay, now it was making more sense. In response to this, Caesar did something insane. He renounced his command. By doing this, he also renounced his triumph, which I cannot stress enough was an unthinkable thing for a politician to do. But by doing this, he gained access to the city. People watched, astonished, as he marched right down to the forum and officially declared his candidacy for consul. Caesar already had a strategy in place. He had arranged to run on a joint ticket with a man called Lucius. Since there were 2 consuls, this was sometimes done, but it was the exception rather than the norm. Caesar was a young and popular politician running as a reformer. Lucius was a wealthy, more moderate senator with no name recognition or, let's be honest, charisma. Lucius financed the campaign and paid the bribes, while Caesar made the speeches and rallied the people. Unlike Caesar, Lucius was by no means a radical. He was a close friend to Cicero, an extremely influential, slightly conservative but ultimately pragmatic senator. Caesar was desperately seeking Cicero's support, not only for this campaign, but for the year to come. In this respect, Lucius served not only as a piggy bank, but also as an olive branch to the more moderate senators. As the campaign was drawing to a close, it began to dawn on the conservatives that Caesar was the clear frontrunner. Before every consular election, the Senate decided where the next 2 consuls would serve as governors after their term was up. This was done before the election,
between
so
two
the winners weren't
allies
subjected
in
to
a
any
war.
political shenanigans. Since the conservatives couldn't
And the
do
one I
anything about the fact that
chose
Caesar looked like
was
he was gonna win this
horrendously
thing, they decided to
outnumbered.
hijack this process. They started to make a big
But they were
stink
right
in the
next
Senate
door to
about the
me, so
physical
if I chose to
degradation
abandon
of
them,
rural
they'd
Italy.
fucking wreck
This was
my
kinda
shit.
true, so they got some support from their fellow senators. As a solution, they proposed that instead of assigning a province to the next consuls, they should instead spend their time restoring the woodland and country lanes of Italy. Incredibly, the Senate fell for this. The motion passed. To many outside observers, including Caesar, this was another act of sabotage. But Caesar was powerless to do anything about it. Yet. When election day rolled around, everyone kind of figured that Caesar was
I
going to win.
want this place.
The real
Going
question
for it.
became who else would serve as consul. It was a race for second place between Bibulus, Cato's conservative son-in-law, and Lucius, Caesar's uncharismatic ally. In the end, Bibulus won. This
No,
must have come as
it's not a
surprise to
lesson, it's
Caesar,
just
since the plan was
shitty.
for poor old Lucius to ride in on his coattails. Meanwhile, it was a huge coup for the hardline conservatives. Bibulus had planned to put a halt on all new reforms during his term. It was going to be an interesting year.
They
The
both
election for
border
consul
me,
took
but
place
one
in
was
July,
an actual
and
ally.
incoming
so.
consuls didn't actually take power until January 1st, so Caesar had a ton of time to prepare, and he did. Now this hasn't come up yet, but it's important to know. Caesar was in a secret alliance with 2 other senators, Pompey and Crassus. This is known by historians as the First Triumvirate. As consuls, Pompey and Crassus had a terrible time getting any significant legislation past the conservative bloc in the Senate. They each came in making big promises to their supporters, but neither was able to deliver. Pompey had come back from the east, a conquering hero, and had promised to set up colonies for tens of thousands of veterans in the newly conquered territory. This was expensive, and he couldn't get a bill through the Senate. Crassus had promised to bail out the tax collectors, which, as you can imagine, was pretty unpopular. It didn't help matters that on top of this, there was a personal animosity between the two. As a remedy, these 2 men secretly backed this young populace named Julius Caesar. If
I am
Caesar
not
could pass
done with
these
these
bills for
fucking
them, they promised
faggots
to
on my
back the rest of
plan.
his legislative agenda. The group also agreed to pull any bill if one of the 3 found it objectionable. January 1st of 59 BCE rolled around, and Caesar and Bibulus began their term. It was customary for the consul who got the most votes in the election to
Cygors.
take the lead
Fuck.
during the first month, with the second place consul taking the lead during the second month, swapping back and forth for the entire year. This act of taking the lead was called holding fasces. Caesar held fasces first. He immediately ordered scribes to take down all Senate business and to post it outside in the forum for the public to read. Forever the populist, Caesar knew that he
Well,
had
here
the
we
people
go.
on
This
his
is gonna be a
side
pain in the
and
ass.
wanted to increase public pressure on some of his more conservative colleagues. His next move, and we're still talking about the first day of his term, was to put forward an ambitious land reform bill. Let's go into detail on this. At this time, radical land redistribution had been a goal of reformers for over 70 years. Over the last century, Italy's agricultural sector had been hollowed out. The huge influx of slaves and wealth meant that small landowners were being bought up by huge mega plantations, with hordes of slaves doing the actual work.
Right
This
after
had
these
pushed
messages,
entire generations of poor farmers into the cities.
I'm gonna go make
These
a
urban
nice
poor were now eligible
sweet
for
coffee
heavily
thing. I'm
subsidized
feeling like
bread,
having it.
so this was a huge drain on the public coffers. Over the decades, these
in the
mega
meantime, I will
plantations
be right back.
neglected their land, and much of it was just sitting there
He
uncultivated.
can entertain you.
Domestic grain production dropped, while its demand continued to rise. This was a recipe for economic disaster, and the reformers had taken up the cause for generations, with some limited success. Caesar's first bill on his
Are you
first
okay with
day
this?
was meant to address this. He proposed that they set up a land commission, responsible for buying up land from willing mega plantations and redistributing it to the urban poor through a lottery. The expectation was that this would allow for thousands of urban poor to leave the city and set up small, profitable farms on previously unproductive land. In order to maximize the number of people affected, applicants were required to be married men with 3 or more kids. And as a friendly gesture to Pompey, veterans were also allowed to apply. These new farmers were forbidden from selling their land for 20 years in order to prevent the mega plantations from just going around and buying it all up again. Many senators were concerned with the cost of this plan. As a concession to them, Caesar allowed for a region in central Italy called Campania to be exempted from the bill, since much of the land here was actually owned by the government and provided a steady source of income. The land commission was to be made up of 20 prominent Romans, appointed by the consul, who would then be responsible for the land purchases. After some senators raised objections, Caesar added a line to the bill that barred himself from serving as a commissioner. The thing is, before the public assembly could approve any bill, it had to be posted publicly for 24 days. Normally this wouldn't really matter, but Caesar had to hold fasces when the law went into effect. He needed the 20 men on the commission to be answerable to him. If the law went into effect when Bibulus held fasces, he could just stack the commission with a bunch of guys that would just reject every land sale. Caesar only had a few days to get this bill through the Senate if he wanted to get it passed by the public assembly before February. After the initial compromises were made, Caesar painstakingly went line by line and read the entire bill in front of the Senate, stopping after every sentence and asking if there were objections. There were none. After he was done, debate opened up, and Cato rose to comment. He spoke about how it was a very fine bill, but this year was just a bad time to do any major land reform. And then he kept talking, and kept talking. The dude was filibustering the bill. Caesar was beside himself. He had held the Senate's hand through this entire process, made compromises left and right, and yet Cato was still trying to torpedo this bill for no specific reason. Caesar snapped. He ordered Cato arrested. He had the authority to do this as consul, but the Senate erupted into chaos. A bunch of senators stormed out, with one telling Caesar to his face that he'd rather be in prison with Cato than in the Senate with Caesar. The whole thing was a major misstep. Not only did Caesar alienate the entire Senate by trampling on its prerogatives, but he gave ammunition to his enemies. This is when they started to call him a tyrant. Caesar backed down. He released Cato and adjourned the Senate for the day. It was obvious that Cato and his conservatives weren't going to play nice, so Caesar had to think creatively. He took to the streets. He posted the full text of the land bill in the forum for anybody to read, and simply proclaimed that the public assembly would vote in 24 days. He then went around and started to make a series of speeches promoting the bill to the public. The Senate never passed the bill. Caesar just decided to skip a step. Due to a quirk in the Roman constitution, this wasn't technically against the law, but it just wasn't done. Pompey and Crassus surprised everybody by vocally supporting what Caesar was doing, which added some legitimacy to the whole thing. Caesar even invited Bibulus to come and debate the merits of the bill before the public. He came, but the crowd was so whipped up that he was booed off the stage before he even got a chance to speak. At the end of the 24-day grace period, it was time for the public assembly to vote on the bill. Before the vote, a large conservative delegation arrived, led by Bibulus and Cato, and followed by all of the conservative tribunes of the plebs and a bunch of lesser senators. The inclusion of the tribunes was significant, because both they and the consuls had the power to veto the proceedings. They had come to do just that. Upon their arrival, the crowd flew into a frenzy. Bibulus was making his way towards the speaking platform when the crowd attacked him. His bodyguards were overpowered, and he was pulled into the crowd. Bibulus legitimately thought that he was about to be killed. Instead, the crowd dumped feces on his head. The conservatives were absolutely distraught over what they saw and fled for their own safety. Once they were gone, a vote was called and the land reform bill passed with a huge majority. Now, Bibulus would later claim that during this incident he was exercising his veto the entire time, making the entire vote illegal. Caesar would claim that the roar of the crowd was so loud that nobody could hear what anybody was saying. You can decide for yourself who you believe. At last, Caesar finally got to appoint his commissioners, and oh, look at that, top of the list, Pompey and Crassus. On February 1st, Bibulus held fasces. His first act was to call for a meeting of the Senate to officially condemn Caesar for his use of mob violence. At a minimum, he wanted the vote overturned, and there was even talk of stripping Caesar of his consulship. The speaking order in the Senate always went in order of prestige, and in this case the order turned out to be very significant. Bibulus held fasces, so he got to speak first. As the other sitting consul, Caesar spoke second, in his own defense. Then, consuls from the previous years got to speak, two of whom happened to be Pompey and Crassus. They both supported Caesar's actions and said that the vote was legal. This really got people's attention. Not only did Caesar have control over the mob, but he seemed to have the support of some of Rome's most powerful senators too. All of a sudden, no other senators felt comfortable criticizing Caesar. Bibulus's proposal died on the floor. After this incident, Bibulus retreated to his home and basically did not appear again publicly for the rest of his term. In the absence of his colleague, Caesar unexpectedly held fasces again, and as a cherry on top, the Senate was now kind of terrified of him. He had his big signature piece of legislation in place, so he started paying back his allies. The first order of business was to ratify Pompey's conquests in the east. See, Pompey had conquered an incredible amount of territory in the east, adding 4 new provinces to Rome. He also set up new protectorates and negotiated new alliances. Upon his return, the Senate saw fit to award him with a triumph, but didn't bother ratifying his new conquests or treaties. Even when Pompey himself was consul, he couldn't get his own conquests recognized by the Senate, which only shows you how broken this system was during this period. Caesar was able to get this squared away with minimal opposition, much to Pompey's delight. Caesar also had to pay Crassus back for his support. Crassus had been supported by the tax collectors, who had gotten themselves into a bit of a bind. Rome didn't administer its own tax collection, but contracted it out to private companies who bid on how much tax they would be able to collect. Well, in the east, some of the tax collectors found themselves unable to meet their own bids, like by a lot. This was partially due to the fact that Pompey had spent years destroying commerce by conquering everything in sight, and partially due to the fact that the tax collectors just screwed up and overbid. Caesar lowered the amount of tax due by 1/3, and everybody walked away from the whole thing grumbling, but the problem was solved. Another weird piece of old business that Caesar wanted to clear up had to do with Egypt. The previous ruler, Ptolemy XI, having no legitimate heirs, left his kingdom to the Roman Republic in his will. After his death, Ptolemy XII, an illegitimate heir, assumed the throne, and Rome never bothered to press its claim. Finally, in Caesar's year, Ptolemy actually traveled to Rome to lobby for official recognition as the true ruler of Egypt. Apparently, Ptolemy paid Caesar and Pompey a king's ransom in bribes. Caesar asked that the Senate officially recognize Ptolemy's claim, and threw an alliance with Egypt in there for good measure. The Senate agreed, and the whole thing was taken care of. During this flurry of legislative activity, Bibulus, still housebound, would not stay quiet. Consuls had the power to decide when certain festivals and religious holidays were going to happen, and Bibulus was being a nuisance by putting them all on days when Caesar had votes scheduled. Technically, this should have made all of these votes illegal, but Caesar also happened to be Rome's head priest, and he seemed to think it was all okay. The people were quite content to just go along with this because they saw Bibulus as a laughingstock. Meanwhile, in the Senate, Caesar was able to get the money to resettle Pompey's veterans in the east, fulfilling his final legislative obligation to his fellow triumvirs. During the debate for this bill, one ex-consul named Lucullus spoke in opposition. When Caesar pushed back and lightly hinted that maybe it was time to start looking into old corruption charges, Lucullus threw himself on the ground and groveled at Caesar's feet like a slave, right there on the floor of the Senate in front of everybody. This was an ex-consul. It was shocking. You may, or may not, remember all the way back to before Caesar was consul, when the conservatives decided that he was needed to protect the woodland and country lanes of Italy after his term. Well, Caesar hadn't forgotten.
So this guy is getting these two things right here called Cygors. They're fucking overpowered as shit, and they're going to cause some serious problems.
One of Caesar's allies put forward a bill to give him the command of Illyricum, which was on the Adriatic Sea, and Cisalpine Gaul, which was in northern Italy, 2 provinces. This was for a 5-year command, which was longer than normal. He was also given the privilege of picking his own legates, which was usually something the Senate did. Just as this bill was going through, word came in that the governor of Transalpine Gaul had unexpectedly died. This province was just added to the mix, and by the end, the Senate had awarded Caesar 3 provinces and a total of 4 legions. By any conventional standard, this was overkill. Nobody got 3 provinces. I'm sure the Senate's logic was that once Caesar left the capital, politics would slowly return to normal, and if they needed to give him 3 provinces to convince him to leave, that was fine. It was around this time that Caesar proposed his second land reform bill, only a few months after the first one had gone into effect. We simply do not have enough information on Caesar's motives for this. Either Caesar felt emboldened by his newfound monopoly on power, or he felt that his first land reform bill wasn't as effective as he had hoped. Honestly, I don't know. But with this second bill, he turned his sights towards Campania, the publicly owned land that was explicitly exempted from the first law. There was enough land in Campania for 20,000 small family farms, and since Rome already owned the land, the bill could be implemented immediately, but it faced some fierce opposition in the Senate. Cicero in particular was a vocal opponent, saying that the loss of Campania would be too much for the Roman treasury to take. Caesar tried to bribe Cicero by promising to name him as one of his legates next year, but Cicero refused. In the end, many lesser senators found themselves intimidated or bribed, and the bill was able to squeak through without the support of men like Cicero. For his next mammoth legislative undertaking, Caesar tackled one of his pet projects, and again, it didn't make him any friends in the Senate. for the majority of Caesar's adult life, he had been fascinated with how Roman provinces were governed, and he had some serious proposals for reform. A lot of proposals, actually. He dropped on the Senate's doorstep a bill with over 100 separate chapters, covering everything from administration to tax collection to restrictions on bribery to rules on balancing provincial budgets. It had everything. The conservative bloc in the Senate had devoted their careers to crusading against corruption, so they had a really hard time criticizing this bill. And, by the way, everybody agreed that these reforms were badly needed. The conservatives hated Caesar's guts, but they couldn't find any way to block this bill without looking like complete hypocrites. It passed easily, and these reforms remained in place relatively unchanged for centuries. We are approaching the end of Caesar's term as consul, but at some point in the autumn, something weird happened. We can't say with certainty what happened, but we have rumors. Listen to some of these stories and let's see if a pattern emerges. The first version we hear is this. A man named Vettius came before the Senate and claimed that a senator named Curio, one of Caesar's chief opponents, planned to murder Pompey. Another version, Vettius said that Curio planned to murder Pompey and Caesar. Another version, Vettius said that Curio and a man named Brutus, maybe you've heard of him, planned to murder Pompey and Caesar. Another version, Vettius said that Curio and Brutus and Bibulus planned to murder Pompey and Caesar. Another version, Vettius said that Curio and Brutus and Bibulus and Cicero's son-in-law planned to murder Pompey and Caesar. Another version, Vettius said that Curio and Brutus and Bibulus and Cicero's son-in-law and Lucullus, that guy who had fallen before Caesar and begged like a slave, planned to murder Pompey and Caesar. You get the idea. It looks like this started off as one rumor that may or may not have been true and conveniently ballooned until it touched almost every one of Caesar's political enemies. Get out your tinfoil hats because there's one more detail we know. The next day, Vettius was found dead. October rolled around and Caesar oversaw the selection of his successors. Bibulus inexplicably kept on pushing back the election date. The reformers ran their candidates, the conservatives ran their candidates, and in the end, the winners were Caesar's father-in-law and one of Pompey's old legates. 2 reformers and 2 allies of Caesar. His legacy was now secure. Consuls officially handed over power on January 1st, and it was customary for them to give a farewell speech at the end of the year. Caesar gave his speech, it was normal, whatever, history doesn't remember it. Then, to everybody's surprise, there was Bibulus. The man hadn't been seen in public all year, and suddenly he wanted to deliver a speech. As he approached the speaking platform, a tribune of the plebs stepped forward. This tribune basically owed his entire career to Caesar. He invoked his veto, stopping Bibulus from giving his farewell speech, and stripping the poor man of his last shred of dignity. Caesar couldn't have asked for a better gift on his last day as consul. When it was time to nominate candidates for the consular election of 63 BCE, the conservatives in Rome were in a tough spot. Many of the older conservatives still had the stink of Sulla's reign of terror on them, which is this whole can of worms that I'm not going to get into today.
Sulla was a dictator that ended up killing a whole bunch of people.
Sulla was still too young to be eligible for higher office. In desperation, the conservatives turned to this young senator from an unknown family named Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero was from a small town in central Italy, and rose to prominence as a lawyer and later as a skilled administrator. Cicero was a citizen, but not Roman in the sense of being from the city of Rome, and everybody could tell. His detractors would call him a foreigner and an immigrant for most of his life. Supporting Cicero was a bit of a gamble for the conservatives.
That one hurt.
He had a reputation for being a constitutionalist and for being against corruption and bribery, but he was still an outsider. Would he respect the Senate's prerogatives? What they didn't know at the time and what we know now is that Cicero favored stability and order and peace above all else. They had all lived through this painful civil war, and Cicero believed that Rome's constitution was the best defense against another one. So the conservatives backed Cicero. It's not like they had much of a choice. The other 2 major candidates for consul that year were Catilina, aka Catiline, who was one of the leaders of the Reform faction, and Antonius, the uncle of Marcus Antonius, aka Mark Antony, Caesar's future right-hand man. Antonius was loosely aligned with the reformers, but in my opinion, just seemed like an ambitious idiot. More on him later. Cicero didn't have a lot of money to spend on this campaign, so he did something as old as politics itself. He attacked the character of his two opponents. He was particularly brutal when it came to Catilina. He accused him of deliberately stealing from non-Romans during Sulla's dictatorship, which is just another way of saying, hey, non-Roman citizens, I'm one of you, vote for me. He constantly reminded voters that his opponents were complicit in the dictatorship, while Cicero had kept his hands clean. And even more, he accused both of them of being close friends with a young Julius Caesar, who was running for praetor that year and was already a very polarizing figure. Cicero also fought hard for the support of the wealthy business class. Some of the more radical reformers were making them nervous, and they were open to supporting someone like Cicero, promising stability. Cicero won in a landslide. Antonius came second, and he would serve as Cicero's co-consul. He was less strongly associated with Sulla than Catilina was, which I think explains his win. Catilina was understandably upset by his third-place finish. He was arguably Rome's
so it looks
most
like we're gonna
prominent
crush
reformer.
this.
It was humiliating. He still had his seat in the Senate, but he immediately began preparing to run for consul again next year. When Cicero took office in January of 63 BCE, he did something so incredibly smart that I can't believe it didn't become common practice. He was assigned one of the best provinces to govern after his term, Macedonia. He went to Antonius and was like, hey, you want a trade? They negotiated a deal. If Antonius stayed out of Cicero's way all year, he could have Cicero's province. This is the last time you'll hear about Antonius in this video, but he was around, just doing whatever Cicero told him to do. The first major problem to confront Cicero is something we're all familiar with now: land reform. It was 4 years before Caesar's year as consul, and the land reform was still the perennial objective of the reformers. Cicero had no interest in bringing this issue up, but it was proposed by one of the new tribunes of the plebs. Cicero had to figure out how to deal with it. The actual bill was kind of similar to the land reform bills that Caesar would later pass, only smaller in scope. A commission, 10 members this time, were to buy up land and redistribute it via lottery to the urban poor. In order to pay for this, the commission was authorized to sell publicly owned land in Italy and abroad. At the time, Cicero thought that Caesar was secretly behind this bill, but he had no proof. Based on the similarities between this bill and the one that Caesar would later pass, we can look back with some hindsight and say that, yeah, he was probably right. Cicero did everything he could to turn public opinion against this bill. He went around stirring up old fears, calling the 10 commissioners the 10 kings. He did his job, because the Senate voted down the bill and there was very little public backlash. The downside of all of this is that the reformers now saw Cicero as an arch-conservative, which honestly he really wasn't. He was an institutionalist, and his problem with land reform was just that it was destabilizing. Cicero may have been consul, but he was still a lawyer at heart. He spent a lot of time in the courts during his year, serving as the defense attorney in 2 major cases. The first was some really stupid case where some of the reformers accused a conservative senator of a murder 37 years ago. It was a big, stupid, politically motivated thing. The guy was innocent and everybody knew it. Cicero saw it as his duty as consul to defend the senator. The case ended just as stupidly as it began, when Cicero and his allies deliberately caused a mistrial by using some
even under artillery fire.
The guy got off, but I mean, if you ask me, nobody really walked away from it looking particularly great. Cicero's second legal case will come later, but first he had to oversee the elections for next year's consuls. Cicero learned from his intelligence network, or more accurately I would say his wife's intelligence network, that Catilina, the guy who came in third last year and was a candidate again this year, was plotting a series of assassinations on election day. When election day came, Cicero openly wore body armor, something you weren't really supposed to do, and showed up with a gang of bodyguards. For whatever reason, maybe the assassins were intimidated by this show of force, violence was averted. Cicero oversaw the election of his 2 successors, and in a cruel twist of fate, Catilina came in third again. Apparently he pretty much bankrupted himself paying out bribes. He didn't have the means to run for consul a 3rd time. Cicero's second legal case came up after the elections and was a lot more consequential. One of the losers of the consular election was accusing one of the winners of bribery and wanted the results thrown out. This had the potential of being really destabilizing. Bribing people during elections was very illegal and very common. Everybody did it. Cicero had even campaigned against bribery, while his conservative backers continued to bribe everybody behind the scenes. It wasn't escapable. Cicero's logic was, if we start throwing out election results because of bribery, every future election would be followed by a court case. He chose to lead the defense. Cato, the arch-conservative, represented the prosecution. It got ugly. Cato went on and on about how corruption and bribery had seeped into Roman public life, which all happened to be true. Cicero responded by not addressing the facts of the case because, again, the defendant was definitely guilty and just mocked Cato to his face. He called his philosophy silly. He called him unrealistic. He even made an obnoxious appeal to nationalism, saying something along the lines of, "This isn't Greece. Here in Rome, things get messy, but things get done." Cicero won the case, but ugh, gross. After this, in a kind of symbolic gesture to prove that he wasn't pro-bribery, Cicero introduced and passed a law that increased the punishment for blatant bribery to up to 10 years of exile. Again, this was symbolic and more of a message to future candidates, saying, okay guys, pull back on the bribery a bit, it's getting out of control. In October, after all of the turmoil with the elections was finally put to rest, Crassus, a senator from the Reform faction, came to see Cicero. He showed Cicero a letter he had received,
why can't I just pay people off?
Of a secret
Alright,
plan
I'm broke.
to overthrow the government, masterminded by Catilina. Around the same time, Cicero started to hear reports of a small army mustering north of Rome. These two things had to be linked. Cicero presented his evidence to the Senate and placed Catilina under house arrest. As a precaution, the Senate passed a law called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, aka the Final Decree or the Final Act, which empowered the consuls to do whatever was necessary to defend the republic. Think of it as a form of martial law. Cicero's wife's spies learned that one night, Catilina slipped his guards and attended a meeting where, again, a plot was hatched to assassinate Cicero. After learning of this, Cicero put his home on lockdown, and his gang of bodyguards wouldn't let anybody through without the right password. This seems pretty basic to us, but Roman homes were normally open to the public, and the act of giving a password like this was a well-known military tradition. Cicero basically transformed his home into a military encampment. The symbolism wasn't lost on anybody. At the next meeting of the Senate, Cicero put forward a bill to banish Catilina. He was empowered to do whatever he deemed necessary under the final act, but he wanted to stay on the same side as the Senate. Unfortunately, nobody wanted to put themselves on the record against Catilina. Cicero, realizing that he had misread the room, quickly switched tactics and was like, okay, how about we banish this random other senator instead? The Senate was like, but he did nothing wrong. And Cicero was like, aha, so you admit Catilina did something wrong.
Hello, welcome back.
Cicero's finest moment.
I won that battle,
end,
nice
he
and
was
easy.
Right, though, because Catilina fled the city that night and joined up with the army in the north, and declared himself the head of the new government in waiting. The situation was now on the precipice of civil war. Sometime later, one of Catilina's allies in the city went to a diplomat from a Gallic tribe visiting Rome and was like, hey, we're gonna overthrow the government, let's team up. The diplomat went directly to Cicero and reported to him what had happened. Cicero was like, no, go along with it. Now he had a spy on the inside of the conspiracy. The Gallic diplomat set up a big meeting with a bunch of conspirators to coordinate their plans. And when everybody showed up, Cicero was there with his bodyguards, and all of the traitors were arrested. Cicero went before the Senate and said that he wanted these guys put to death. His argument was that the city was a powder keg, and they had no way of knowing how deep the conspiracy went. If they executed these leaders, it might be enough to put an end to the whole rebellion and avert a war. Remember, the Senate had already empowered Cicero to do whatever was necessary to keep the Republic safe, so he was not required to get the Senate's permission for any of this. But Cicero believed in the Senate, and he didn't want to go against their wishes. Both of the incoming consuls agreed with Cicero, put the prisoners to death. All of the ex-consuls agreed as well. So did all of the praetors. When it came time for the incoming praetors to weigh in, Julius Caesar rose to speak. Caesar argued that executing these men without a trial was an authoritarian thing to do, and it set a dangerous precedent for the future. He suggested that instead they should be sentenced to life imprisonment. This argument made Cicero suspicious. Remember, Caesar was friends with Catilina. How much was he involved in all of this? Caesar's appeal against authoritarianism was well received by the Senate, and a majority of them began to come around to his idea of imprisonment.
After they heard speeches from all of the ex-praetors, aediles, ex-aediles, and quaestors, they finally got all the way down to the ex-quaestors, which was when Cato got
Let's just do this.
Cato was only 32 years old at this time, but he was already cultivating one hell of a reputation. He chastised the Senate for putting the entire Republic at risk for the sake of their weak stomachs. Cato, for once in his life, urged them to be pragmatic. He argued that eliminating the threat and preserving the Republic was the highest priority.
There we go.
And if the Senate woke up tomorrow to find the city in flames, they would have nobody to blame but themselves. The mood in the Senate shifted yet again. Cato had convinced them. A vote was called, and the
I like
Senate
listening to
voted
this.
in favor of executing the prisoners. Caesar went into a
This is
frenzy.
what I've literally
He
listened to
started
for the last
screaming and
4
launched
days.
himself at the opposition.
I've heard this video like
Others tried
4
to hold him
times.
back,
I don't
and
even
suddenly
care.
Everybody was on their
Good.
feet as a bit of a fight broke out on the floor of the Senate. Cicero called for his bodyguards. They entered, swords drawn, and surrounded the senators. There was a tense standoff. After a beat, Caesar turned and stormed out of the Senate House. He would not return again while Cicero was consul. Let me pause here for a moment. Understand how shocking this was. Swords were forbidden inside the city of Rome, but at some point, Cicero had secretly armed his men. Even more shocking was the fact that there was almost bloodshed on the floor of the Senate, and it was almost Caesar's blood. Let's just sit with that for a minute. Cicero left the Senate, followed by a horde of senators, and went to retrieve all of the prisoners from the homes where they were being locked up. He led them down to the Roman jail. Side note, I just learned this. The jail was actually an old converted cistern.
Okay, let's see what I
for
can do here.
holding water, so you could only enter it through the roof. Pretty cool. Anyway, Cicero and the senators led the prisoners onto the roof of the jail. One by one, they tied nooses around their necks and had them jump in. After the last conspirator was dead, Cicero turned to the crowd and announced what he had just done. When the rebel army to the north heard what had happened to their leaders, most of them fled. The Senate sent an army of their own to deal with them, and it was just a one-sided slaughter. Catiline and the rest of the leaders of the conspiracy died on the battlefield. The Senate declared that for his actions, Cicero was to be honored with the title of Father of the Republic. At this point, Cicero's term was nearly over, but for his remaining days as consul, a crowd would follow him wherever he went, cheering and applauding. Cicero would consistently call this the proudest moment of his life.
Okay, let's just recolonize the city, make it my own. Skaven.
Cato was never elected consul, so video over. Goodbye. But I feel like talking about Cato, so let's look at his term as tribune of the plebs in 62 BCE. Well, mostly. For whatever reason, tribunes of the plebs took office on December 10th, so the beginning of Cato's year slightly overlaps with the end of Cicero's year. When Cato took office late in 63 BCE, the conservatives had already joined forces and destroyed most of the Catiline conspiracy. The city was now safe, but sharply divided. Groups of Catilinus supporters had been hanging around outside of the Senate House, harassing senators and threatening to start a riot. In this context, Cato's role as the tribune of the plebs
This is
became all the more
garbage.
important.
Versus
There were 10
my
of them
garbage.
elected
Oh,
every year,
fuck.
and they could propose legislation to both
Garbage
the popular
versus
assembly and to the
garbage.
Senate. They
Great.
could also veto any legislation or action coming from any other elected official. You can think of them as a popular counterbalance against the Senate. It was kind of strange that a staunch conservative and a creature of the Senate was elected to this office, which was usually dominated by populists and reformers. But with the conservatives politically ascendant, and the city still on the brink of violence, Cato knew that everyone was anxious to see what his faction was going to do next. The first thing Cato did was introduce legislation related to the grain dole. For the past 60 years, Rome had operated a public program where they had bought grain from overseas, stored it in government-run warehouses, and sold it at subsidized rates throughout the year to poor citizens who met certain requirements. Traditionally, the conservative faction had liked to make a show of chipping away at the grain dole whenever possible. Now, Cato put legislation forward that would quadruple the size of the dole overnight.
Cato
So what was Cato
was a
doing?
conservative.
He was co-opting one of the big legislative goals of the reform faction. He was betting, rightly in my opinion, that a well-fed city was much less likely to support radical revolutionaries
job.
like Catalina.
He also wanted to associate reformers with the negative aspects of the Catalan conspiracy, and disassociate them from some of the more popular stuff, like expanding the grain dole. Cato introduced the bill before the Senate, and although Cicero, as consul, raised some objections at the extremely high cost of the bill, many other conservatives got on board, and it passed easily. As you would expect, it was even more popular with the public assembly, who stood to benefit from the bill directly. It was passed into law. Imagine the logistical nightmare of having to buy and store all of that additional grain. Some poor bureaucrat's job instantly got 4 times harder. Sometime later, Cicero had left office. The leading
Just get a second
conspirators had
monitor.
been executed, but a small ragtag rebel army remained on the field. Another tribune of the plebs, a guy named Metellus Nepos, put a bill before the Senate to recall Pompey and his army from the east, and to have him take command of the city. Cato opposed this, saying that the conspiracy was under control and, hey, let's be reasonable. We've got 2 perfectly competent consuls here, elected by the people. Why don't we just let one of them take care of the army? Metellus responded by calling Cato a coward, and threatened to ignore the Senate's advice on this matter and take the bill directly to the public assembly. Cato responded by saying something along the lines of, Pompey and his army enters this city over my dead body. Let's back up for some context. The last time somebody had taken command of the city, they had installed themselves as dictator and systematically murdered their political opponents. I've touched on this before. This was Sulla. Pompey had been one of Sulla's lieutenants, so you can understand why this was setting off alarms in Cato's head. He had no intention of letting history
I
repeat
want to
itself.
attack this city.
Days later,
You know what?
Metellus
Fuck
did
it.
as he had promised, and took his bill to the public assembly without the consent of the Senate. Cato went down there with another conservative tribune of the plebs to put a stop to the whole thing. Metellus instructed a clerk to begin proceedings by reading the bill aloud, and Cato immediately vetoed it. Metellus then took over reading the bill himself, and Cato vetoed it again, this time grabbing the bill from his hands. Metellus continued reciting the bill from memory, and Cato's conservative colleague threw his hand over Metellus' mouth to stop him from
Oh
speaking.
yeah, wow,
By
okay.
the way, violence against the tribune of the plebs was a crime punishable by death, and this seems like an act of violence to me, but nothing would come of it. Anyway, the crowd saw this altercation going down on the stage, and started attacking the other conservatives in attendance. The crowd only dispersed when rumors started to spread that a consul was approaching with a gang of armed men. Something that would have
Oh, I
been
see what you're
illegal if
saying.
it had
I
been
misread
true,
you
which it
completely.
wasn't.
Like
The
Twitch
crowd scattered
has.
anyways,
Yeah,
and
it
the
would be
bill was not
nice.
passed. Metellus was so bitter over this incident that he left the city in protest. Tribunes of the plebs were actually forbidden from leaving the city during their term, but considering the laundry list of illegal stuff that had just happened, nobody bothered to stop him. The Senate formally endorsed Cato's handling of the situation. They tried to go a step further and strip Metellus of his tribuneship, not for fleeing the city, but for starting a riot. But Cato talked them out of it. Side note, Julius Caesar had publicly supported Metellus through this whole ordeal. He was serving as one of the 8 praetors that year, but when Metellus fled the city,
Yeah,
Caesar
that would be
renounced
useful.
his praetorship in solidarity. The next day, an angry mob assembled outside Caesar's home, wanting to march on the Senate and do God knows what. Caesar spoke to the mob, calmed everybody down, and sent them home. The Senate was impressed by Caesar's statesmanship, and restored him to the office he had just resigned. But Cato voted against this. Caesar had had some suspicious peripheral role in the Catalan conspiracy, and now he had some peripheral role in this Metellus affair. This didn't sit right with Cato. From this moment on, the rivalry between these 2 men would only grow.
Yep. It's a pretty useful feature.
Publius Clodius Pulcher was one of the tribunes of the plebs in 58 BCE, and we're going to talk about what he did during his year, but first we have to set the stage a bit. Before 58, Clodius had been a minor player in the Reform faction. He was around for some of the events that we've talked about already. Clodius, or Claudius as he was known at this time, served as one of Cicero's bodyguards during the Catalan conspiracy in 63 BCE. Then, at the end of Cato's year as tribune of the plebs in 62, Claudius was caught in a sex scandal. Here's the short version. A religious ceremony was being held in Julius Caesar's home. This particular ceremony was being performed by women, so Caesar was gone and his wife Pompeia was leading it. For some stupid reason, Claudius dressed up as a woman and snuck into the ceremony, intent on seducing Caesar's wife. He was discovered, obviously. As you can imagine, this was a juicy scandal, and it would become the obsession of the political class. Caesar would end up divorcing his wife over this incident. Claudius was put on trial for committing a sacrilege, and what followed became the trial of the century.
Yeah, no one watches
Caesar
my
ended up
shit
as one
anymore.
of Claudius's most vocal supporters. This seems weird to us, and it seemed weird to people at the time, but these men were both reformers, and apparently Caesar was more interested in supporting his political ally than his own wife. Claudius's whole defense was that he wasn't even in Rome on the day in question. Cicero was the only person willing to testify that that wasn't true. Claudius saw this as a betrayal, and he wouldn't forget it. Against all odds, Claudius was acquitted. Word is that both judge and jury benefited from huge bribes from prominent reformers. The ruling was just as scandalous as the crime itself. Anyway, let's jump ahead. Claudius would go on to be elected quaestor, and would receive a lifetime appointment to the Senate as a result. During Caesar's year in 59, Claudius got it into his head that he wanted to run for tribune of the plebs. Why? Here's my theory. The system for electing
So I'm gonna draw my line out
was
really
heavily
long.
weighted towards the rich and powerful. These people hated Claudius's guts from the whole sex scandal thing. He was still a few years away from being eligible for praetor, but he needed to beef up his resume if he wanted to stand a chance. Plus, we shouldn't overlook the fact that Caesar's election in 59 was a big turning point for the reform faction. They had been in the political wilderness ever since the Catiline conspiracy, and Claudius was eager to be part of Caesar's new populist wave. But there was one catch. Claudius was part of an old patrician family, and was therefore ineligible to run for tribune of the plebs. The hint is in the name. The tribune actually had to be a plebeian. So with the help of Caesar and Pompey, Claudius came up with a scheme to get around this restriction. He renounced his patrician status, and was adopted into some random plebeian family, with Caesar as Rome's head priest conducting the adoption ceremony. The whole thing was a farce. His new adoptive father was younger than he was. To show off his new plebeian status, Claudius changed his name to Clodius, and immediately threw his hat in the ring to become one of next year's tribunes of the plebs. He won. I've mentioned this before, but tribunes of the plebs started their terms in December, so he got to overlap a little bit with Caesar's term as consul. The first notable thing he did, and we can now recognize the full importance of this act, was to veto Bibulus' final speech on his last day as consul. Clodius wanted to align himself publicly with Caesar, and humiliating Bibulus was a great way to do just that. Clodius came in with a full slate of populist reforms he wanted to pass, very ambitious for a tribune of the plebs. First, he proposed a bill that made the grain dole not just heavily subsidized, but 100% free for all qualifying Romans. You can just imagine how this drove the conservatives crazy. Cato had radically expanded the grain dole in an attempt to mollify.
That's exactly where I got it from.
I guess it didn't work. After Cato and Clodius expanded and deepened the grain dole, it took up a significant portion of Rome's annual budget. Cicero raised objections to the high cost of this,
shit,
like he did last time with Cato. But with two reformers as consuls, Cicero didn't have enough support to halt the momentum of the populists. The bill passed. Clodius then introduced the bill, further aligning himself with Caesar. The bill would take away the consul's ability to shut down public business over bad omens. This was one of the tools that Bibulus had used when he attempted to undermine Caesar's year as consul. With this bill, the message was clear. The reformers intended to have electoral success going forward, and these little procedural tricks weren't going to fly anymore. What Bibulus did was still very unpopular with the public, so the bill passed easily. Cato had made Caesar's life a living hell during his year, and Clodius wanted to eliminate him as a potential threat. His plan was a little complicated, but here it goes. Clodius argued that in the east,
I was going to advance my line forward, but the Skaven are really shitty,
Egypt's influence,
and they really wanted to charge into my army.
Remember, Egypt had been left in a will to the Roman Republic, and Rome hadn't really done anything about it. So Caesar had settled the issue by accepting huge bribes and renouncing Rome's claim. Clodius introduced legislation arguing that this deal didn't extend to Cyprus, since it wasn't technically part of Egypt. Was Clodius right? In a strictly legal sense, maybe, but it seemed clear to me that the spirit of Caesar's deal with Ptolemy was that Rome would leave Egypt alone. After only a year, Rome was beginning to chip away at that agreement. After that bill was passed, he followed it up with another one, saying that Cato should officially oversee Rome's annexation of Cyprus. This was just a ploy to get Cato out of the way, by sending him overseas to do a job that any nameless bureaucrat could do. but Cato felt honor-bound to obey the will of the Senate, so he went. Clodius was a busy lad, but it was all building to a purpose. He introduced another piece of legislation, taking away the provinces that had been assigned to the sitting consuls, and giving them more prestigious and wealthy ones instead. Clodius was doing two things here. He was signaling to the reformers that we take care of our own, and he was basically bribing the consuls for what would come next. Now,
so see how they were all engaged there?
Machinations so far were building to this. He introduced a bill that would make it retroactively illegal for any public official to execute any citizen without trial. Key word, retroactively. There was no mistaking who this bill was targeting. The only living person it applied to was Cicero, who had executed the ringleaders of the Catiline conspiracy in his year. He had done so with the approval of the Senate, but it didn't matter. This bill would make it illegal anyway. The two sitting consuls, being sympathetic reformers and sufficiently bribed, backed the bill. It's a testament to the strong populist energy in the air that Cicero's personal popularity in the Senate wasn't enough to stop this from happening. The bill passed. Finally, Clodius would have his revenge. He officially charged Cicero for the executions of the prisoners during the Catiline conspiracy. When they went to trial, Clodius seemed to be getting a lot of support from the people. At times, the audience in attendance could get pretty rowdy, and at the end of each day when Cicero would walk home, a group would follow him, shouting insults and pelting him with stones. Cicero began to fear for his life. After several days of this, he made the difficult decision to flee the city. Clodius jumped all over this. As soon as he found out, he introduced another bill, formally banishing Cicero and seizing all of his property. The trial showed how much influence Claudius was gaining out on the streets, and the Senate didn't have the courage to stand up against him. The bill passed, and Cicero would spend the next year of his life in exile. Like the rest of the Senate, Pompey had stayed quiet during the debate to banish Cicero, but Pompey liked Cicero, and more importantly, he liked his politics. He began working behind the scenes to gather the support from other senators to overturn Cicero's banishment. Clodius caught wind of this, and ordered his growing gang out on the street to focus their attention on Pompey. They gave him the same treatment they gave Cicero, and it got so bad that Pompey didn't feel safe leaving his home. They may not have realized it at the time, but Clodius had effectively seized control of the government. Rome's politics were broken. But Clodius's opponents had one more trick up their sleeve, and it's the oldest political trick in the book. They just decided to put him down and wait him out. 8 of the 10 tribunes of the plebs joined forces and blocked all significant legislation from everybody. Pompey and other senators started lobbying next year's consuls to overturn Cicero's banishment after Clodius was out of office. It would take months and months of hard work, but in time, the Senate would get Cicero home. Clodius's year may have ended with gridlock, but he would go down as the most consequential tribune of the plebs in more than 60 years, and in the years to follow, his influence would only grow.
That did not feel like a good victory.
When the consuls for the year 57 BCE assumed office, Rome was in bad shape. Cicero had been banished from the city, Clodius and his supporters were on the streets, and political violence was on the rise. 2 new consuls were walking into this mess. The first was Lentulus, a well-respected politician on friendly terms with Caesar and Pompey, as well as Cicero. The second was Metellus Nepos. He was not well-respected. He was a populist who got into a bit of a tussle with Cato in 62 BCE, which had ended with him being humiliated and fleeing Rome in disgrace. But he was one of Pompey's people, and Pompey's support was enough to secure for him the consulship.
You mean glorified
Cicero's
80s
younger
porn
brother,
music?
Quintus went to Pompey at the beginning of the year to make a deal on his brother's behalf. He promised that if Pompey could get Cicero's banishment lifted, Cicero would agree not to criticize Pompey, Caesar, or Crassus openly. Remember that these 3 were in a secret alliance. Pompey agreed, but he had to run it by his allies first. So a messenger was sent to Caesar in Cisalpine Gaul. Initially, Caesar wasn't super supportive. He was still feeling sore towards Cicero for not supporting his agenda during his year as consul. But getting this kind of concession from one of Rome's most influential politicians was too good to pass up. He agreed. Crassus had no special quarrel with Cicero, so he was cool with it too. With that, it was decided. Pompey pulled some strings, and at the Senate's first meeting, Lentulus put forward a proposal to lift Cicero's banishment. Cicero's personal popularity in the Senate remained high, so that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the Senate had been strong-armed by Clodius the year before, and had felt pressured to force Cicero into exile. But with Lentulus introducing the bill and Metellus Nepos supporting it, and Pompey speaking passionately on its behalf, everybody felt comfortable getting on board. It passed with a huge majority. As always, the legislation went to the public assembly to be rubber-stamped by the people. Clodius was no longer in elected office, but he was still a senator and had voted against the bill. And more importantly, he still had his gangs of supporters out on the streets. On the day of the vote, Clodius showed up with his gang, which included a bunch of gladiators armed with swords. Let's not gloss over this. Up to this point, political violence had been somewhat normalized in Rome. Pushing and shoving had become common. Open street fights between different factions were becoming more and more frequent. But make no mistake, Clodius was bringing this to a whole new level. All of our sources say that he brought gladiators, but don't forget that these were professional killers and Clodius was paying them. We have a word for that: mercenaries, armed with swords.
Let's get rid of this cheap
Rome
shit
was
unit.
supposed to be a demilitarized zone, and swords were forbidden in the city. I can't overstate how significant this was. This was looking more and more like an armed militia.
Okay.
Clodius's supporters moved against the public assembly, and
Well,
there's
since
no
that's
other
my
way to
last
say
viewer,
it.
thank
It
you
was
for watching.
horrible. Dead bodies covered the streets, and people fled in terror. Several of the tribunes of the plebs were seriously wounded, which, let's not forget, was a death penalty offense. Cicero's brother, Quintus, was there to see the lifting of his brother's banishment, and he survived the slaughter only by crawling under some bodies and pretending to be dead. Titus Annius Milo was a popular, conservative tribune of the plebs, and for him, this was a life-altering experience. He decided, on that day, that the only way to put an end to this political violence was to fight fire with fire. Milo rallied his supporters and told them to take to the streets. He then enlisted his own cadre of gladiators, or mercenaries, whatever we're calling them, and illegally armed them with swords of their own. From that moment on, whenever Clodius showed up and started to cause trouble on the streets, Milo responded by rallying his supporters and causing trouble in return. Violent clashes broke out all over the city, and the death toll skyrocketed. We have one description of the Tiber being filled with corpses, and the ground on the
Dead
forum
bodies
being covered in
everywhere.
blood. This wasn't just gangs getting into fistfights anymore. These were men armed to the teeth, showing up with the intent to kill. This was anarchy. As the body count continued to rise,
Dead bodies
public opinion began to
everywhere.
turn. The mob violence was horrifying, and normal citizens began to call for Cicero's return. There are two reasons for this. First, people were hopeful that the violence would stop if Cicero's banishment was taken off the table. Second, Cicero was most well known for being the guy who restored order during the Catiline conspiracy. This rule of law kind of conservatism was now looking pretty good, and as a result, Cicero's personal popularity soared. If Cicero was popular in Rome, he was a rock star in the rest of Italy. He had been born a provincial Italian, not a native Roman, and the Italians viewed him as one of their own. It helped matters that he put in the work to maintain these relationships, especially with some of the richer landowners in the countryside. Pompey could sense that Rome was approaching a tipping point, so he went on a tour of Italy, giving speeches and whipping up support. People from all over the countryside began to flood into Rome to voice their support for overturning Cicero's banishment. With Cicero's popularity higher than ever, the consul Lentulus launched a trial balloon. He introduced some legislation that didn't actually do anything except formally thank everybody in Rome who was working to get Cicero's banishment lifted. This passed with plenty of support and got through the public assembly without any violence. That was a good sign, so for the second time, he introduced the legislation that would formally lift Cicero's banishment. And again, Clodius voted against the bill, but it didn't matter. It passed with plenty of support. When it went before the public assembly, many powerful senators joined together and spoke to the crowd in support of the bill. Milo and his hired gladiators, armed with swords, were lined up protecting the stage. Clodius showed up with his supporters, but when he saw Milo's show of force, that scared him off. The bill was approved by the public assembly pretty much unanimously. Cicero was free to re-enter the city. When he finally did, he was greeted with cheering crowds. Cicero spoke before the Senate and singled out Pompey, thanking him for working tirelessly behind the scenes to get his banishment lifted. And with Cicero finally back in the Senate, it was back to business. The most pressing issue to attend to was the fact that Rome
So I'm gonna
was
go take that
currently in
one
the
army
middle of a
across
food
the
shortage.
ocean.
Clodius's grain program, which had been passed last year, had promised free food to the urban poor. Supplies simply couldn't keep up, and Rome's granaries were dry. Cicero suggested that the Senate appoint a special commissioner to take command of Rome's agricultural supply chain. This commissioner would have unilateral authority to go and fix the problem, with the power to override regional governors or generals. Cicero then suggested that Pompey be that man. Lentulus seized on this idea and formally put it before the Senate. With Cicero's support and the support of both consuls, it passed easily. We can kind of piece together the deal that was made here. Cicero's banishment gets lifted with the help of Pompey, and now Pompey gets a powerful assignment with the help of Cicero. Pompey left Rome to go and fix the grain situation, and Pompey being Pompey, he did it in no time at all and made it look easy. Cicero was emboldened by his renewed popularity and had some scores to settle. Shortly after Pompey left Rome, Cicero marched up to the Capitoline Hill with a small group of supporters, took the tablet that listed Clodius's accomplishments during his year as tribune of the plebs, and destroyed it. He then gave a speech, arguing that none of Clodius's actions as tribune of the plebs were valid, because his conversion from patrician to plebeian was illegal. Keep in mind that Pompey and Caesar had been the ones to oversee this conversion. Cicero had a legitimate feud with Clodius, but indirectly dragging Pompey and Caesar into it makes it seem like Cicero was beginning to go back on his promise not to criticize them openly. Cicero
Okay,
was
so I'm gonna
making
go for
an
the Slayer
extremely
Shrine so I can
controversial
get rid of some of
claim,
this
and at the
fucking...
next Senate meeting, Cato slapped him down by saying that it would be
Actually,
extremely irregular for them to
I don't need
overturn
to.
an entire year's worth of legislation. Cicero was clearly out for blood, which is why he had opened this full frontal assault on Clodius's entire legislative legacy. But with that avenue closed to him, Cicero began to make it clear that he was particularly interested in overturning a specific piece of legislation, which he considered to be a highly symbolic, lingering personal attack against him. While Cicero had been banished, Clodius had had Cicero's home in the center of Rome demolished.
Actually, we'll get that one
and
so
had
I can get the
erected a
Longbeards.
temple to liberty in its place. To Cicero, this was a daily reminder of his humiliation, and he felt that the only way to complete his political comeback was to rebuild his home. The problem was, you couldn't just tear down a temple. It was a religious issue, which took him before a body we're now familiar with, the College of Pontiffs. Remember, Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus, which meant that he was supposed to oversee the College of Pontiffs, but he was off in Cisalpine Gaul, which meant that the college kind of governed itself. Cicero made his arguments to them, and when he was done, the college discussed the case.
Let's just make you
behind
more
closed
money.
doors. Finally, they came to a decision and made their report to the Senate. The college decided that it didn't feel comfortable overturning all of Clodius's laws, since the Senate had actually affirmed all of his actions when they had voted in favor of his legislation. But taking into account the Senate's acknowledgement that they had acted foolishly when they banished Cicero, the college said that they would be comfortable with changing the designation of the temple, allowing it to be demolished if Cicero wished.
That's set up.
On top of this ruling, the Senate
going
voted
for that
to
city.
put a portion of the bill to rebuild Cicero's home. This was a big symbolic victory for Cicero, even though he would go on to complain that the Senate was deliberately snubbing him by refusing to pay 100% of the cost. You just can't please some people. Clodius was pretty upset by the Senate's rebuke, even if it was symbolic. Once the construction crews started work on Cicero's home, Clodius and his gang attacked, chasing them away.
Who the fuck is number one?
This wasn't
Camry.
quite enough for them, so they also attacked Cicero's brother's home, which was nearby, and set it on fire. Not long after this, Cicero was walking down the street when Clodius's gang attacked him. They were all throwing rocks, and he could see that some had swords. He darted into the home
Trade
of one of his
agreement.
supporters,
Bam.
and a crowd gathered outside to
Military
fend off
access.
Clodius's
Let's
gang.
go. Bam.
When it's no longer safe for senators to go about their daily business, you know the political violence is out of control.
Did you
The
say
continuing
trade
threat of
agreement
this
and
violence
non-aggression
had
pact?
forced the elections
No,
to
I
be
don't actually want a
postponed
non-aggression
several
pact with them.
times. But finally, late in the year, they were helped, and Clodius was elected aedile, proving once and for all that his support remained strong, even after a year of setbacks at the hands of Milo and Cicero. At this point, Clodius and Milo were at each other's throats, each at the head of their own militia. Political rhetoric had reached unprecedented heights, with the two men openly threatening to murder each other in public. And, sadly, it would only get worse.
Let's try and make as much money as I can. Everyone that I can get trade with, I'm gonna try. There.
When we
Good
last
enough.
left the city of Rome, it was falling headlong into anarchy. The radical Senator Clodius had transformed himself into a man of the people, and through the use of street gangs, had disrupted public life in the city. Another senator, a conservative named Milo, had responded by raising street gangs of his own. Public life had slowly returned to normal, but at the cost of violence on the streets and political uncertainty. Milo, the conservative, looked to the courts to bring an
So I'm
end
gonna
to
let
the
the army
violence.
here.
He
Actually,
brought
no.
a case against
Actually, no. I
Clodius,
need those
accusing
slayers.
him of inciting
The slayers are
violence.
good against any
Everybody
rat
knew that
ogres and
Clodius
shit
was
like that,
guilty,
so
but he was
I'll just
able
do
to
that.
bribe and threaten his way to a not guilty verdict. As a big ol' middle finger to Milo, Clodius then brought an identical case against him. Everybody knew that Milo was guilty too, but that didn't stop the Senate from running to his defense. At the trial, as Pompey was speaking on Milo's behalf, Clodius turned to his supporters in the crowd, and together they drowned out Pompey with an obnoxious chant. Clodius would shout, "Who's starving the people to death?" And the crowd would answer, "Pompey." They were referencing the fact that Pompey had been put in charge of Rome's grain supply. Then Clodius would shout, "Who wants to campaign in the east?" And the crowd would answer, "Pompey." There were rumblings that the Senate was going to pick somebody to lead an army to Egypt, and Pompey was definitely interested in the job, so that one was true. Then Clodius would shout, "Who should go instead?" And the crowd would answer, "Crassus." Crassus? Pompey's ally? What did he have to do with this?
That fucking
There had
record
always
scratch.
been unsubstantiated rumors that Crassus was secretly funding Clodius's street violence, and this seemed to confirm that there was some sort of arrangement between the two men. The chants soon died away, and Clodius's supporters changed
Bring a
tactics,
mastercrafted weapons
splitting
because 10% damage for
Before
everything
too long,
is
this
fucking
caused
too
a
good.
fight, mostly because it's bad manners. In the struggle that followed, Pompey was pulled down off the speaking platform. He escaped injured. The trial was called off. After the brawl, Crassus started to make a series of public speeches, arguing that the Senate should put him, and not Pompey, in charge of the yet-to-be-formalized expedition to the east.
13,000 a turn.
Pompey's worst fears were confirmed. The two men were coordinating. This was dangerous. Pompey privately confessed to Cicero that he feared that Crassus would send assassins after him. When it was time for candidates to declare themselves for next year's consulship, the conservatives put forward Cato's brother-in-law, a man named Domitus. If elected, he pledged to recall Caesar from Gaul. and
Okay,
take
now
over
I'll
his
spend another
command.
13,000 next turn.
It was in this context that Caesar summoned Pompey and Crassus to come and meet with him at what we now call the Conference of Luca. Pompey and Crassus were at each other's throats, and Caesar's command was in jeopardy. The secret alliance between these three men, the triumvirate, was splintering. Caesar's political survival depended on Domitus going down in defeat. This is when Caesar suggested that Pompey and Crassus should run against Dominus on a joint ticket. If they won, Pompey and Crassus would have the power to extend Caesar's governorship and secure prestigious governorships for themselves. The three men agreed. As we know, Pompey would get Spain and Crassus would get Syria. The two men returned to Rome, with their alliance renewed. Around this time, Caesar sent a message to Clodius to negotiate a side deal. If Clodius would agree to throw his support behind Pompey and Crassus this year, the Triumvirate would agree to support his older brother's bid for consul next year. Clodius agreed. This was an ingenious bit of politicking on Caesar's part. It was spring now, and the elections were scheduled for the summer. Pompey and Crassus immediately declared their candidacies and started campaigning. But they needed more time, so Clodius summoned his street gangs and did everything he could to disrupt public business. It worked, and the elections were postponed for the sake of public safety. But Clodius's tactics didn't make him any friends. At one point, when the Senate was scheduled to meet, a bunch of his fellow senators physically blocked Clodius from entering the building. Clodius promised that if they didn't let him in, he'd have the Senate house burned down. Yikes. Summer turned to autumn and then winter, and still no elections. When the snows came in Gaul, Caesar allowed his men to travel to Rome as private citizens to vote. And so, late in the year, thousands of off-duty soldiers showed up in the city, and then, coincidentally, the street violence stopped. Elections were scheduled for January. On the last day of the year, Rome's 2 consuls stepped down, and there was nobody there to replace them. On the day of the election, before dawn, a group of conservatives, led by Cato and Domitus, their candidate for consul, showed up at the voting grounds. They wanted to be there early, to make sure that there was no funny business. But there was funny business. A bunch of Pompey and Crassus's supporters were already there, armed. They attacked the conservatives, killing some and driving the rest away. Apparently, Cato was wounded while defending Domitus. After the sun rose, Caesar's soldiers and Clodius's gang members came forward to cast their votes. Pompey and Crassus won their elections easily, surprising nobody. Since this election was taking place in January,
Alright,
the two
so
men
I'm
assumed
going for
office
the border
immediately.
princes right there.
When elections happened, they were supposed to be overseen by consuls. This led to this weird scenario, where Pompey and Crassus were immediately responsible for overseeing the election that they had just participated in. The elections for praetor happened next, and this year Cato was a candidate. As Cato was in the process of winning his election, Pompey arbitrarily dissolved the assembly, citing bad omens. Then, after his armed thugs made their rounds, he started up the voting again. This
I'm reminded that Julius Caesar was the
weirdly,
head priest
a bunch
of Rome.
People switched their votes, and Cato did not win. It was obvious to everybody what Pompey had done, and many in the crowd were upset. Then, they elected the aediles. Pompey began picking and choosing which elections were valid and which were not. Coincidentally, his allies got in, and everybody else had their results thrown out. This was too much for people to handle. Pompey had gone mad with power. There was some pushing and shoving in the election pens. Both factions had secretly brought weapons, and things got deadly pretty quickly. At the end of the day, Pompey returned home victorious, but covered in blood. When his pregnant wife saw him, she fainted, and would later have a miscarriage. His wife, by the way, was Caesar's daughter, Julia. The marriage had been arranged years earlier to cement Caesar and Pompey's alliance through the Triumvirate. Once the dust had settled, Pompey and Crassus had an ally in the Senate introduce legislation giving 5-year governorships to Pompey and Crassus, and a 5-year extension to Caesar. As agreed, Pompey would get Spain, Crassus would get Syria, and Caesar would stay in Gaul. But these weren't normal governorships. The legislation also gave the governors authority to unilaterally declare war, without consulting the Senate. This ruffled a lot of feathers, but eventually the legislation passed, and their obligation to the Triumvirate was fulfilled. And then our sources get a little patchy. But in the fall, we know that the elections were held for the year 54 BCE. Pompey and Crassus supported Clodius's older brother for consul, just as they
5,000 in the
promised.
bank.
He won his election, but so did Domitus, Cato's conservative brother-in-law that ran last year. In the winter, Crassus departed for Syria. He would
Oh
not
right, I
return,
was supposed to
but
build an
we'll
army.
get to that another day. Pompey decided to ignore his previous agreement with Caesar and Crassus and stay in Rome instead of going to Spain. His reasoning was this: let Crassus win victories in Syria. Let Caesar win victories in Gaul. Pompey's military career was already unparalleled. They called him the next Alexander the Great. He had nothing left to prove. He would stay in Rome, free from Caesar and Crassus's influence, and establish himself as the most powerful man in the city.
I think
His
it's time to
subordinates
wield
would
my
govern
army like a
Spain in his
mighty,
absence.
throbbing fucking thumb.
He ended the year by throwing expensive public games. Apparently the big draw was elephant versus elephant fights, which people seemed to like. The games went over pretty well, and Pompey's popularity began to rise. And then, in 54 BCE, his wife unexpectedly died in childbirth. Pompey was genuinely heartbroken, and spent a good portion of the year in mourning. Caesar was off campaigning in Britain that summer, and wouldn't learn about
I
his
need the
daughter's
engineer's
death
forge.
until he returned to the Gallic coast in the fall. Now, the legal bond between Pompey and Caesar was severed, and the triumvirate was back to being as fragile as ever. When the elections for that year rolled around, there was a massive corruption scandal. All of the candidates for consul were caught bribing the consuls who would be overseeing their election. Last year, Pompey had shown everybody how easy it was to pick winners and losers, and everybody was interested in replicating his success. But, fortunately, they were all caught before any of this could happen. Everybody was disqualified, and the election was pushed back 6 months so that new candidates could be found. With violence on the streets and
Long
corrupt
Carstein's being
elections,
overrun.
Romans were feeling like the political system was becoming more and more unstable. People began to whisper that Pompey should step up and re-establish order. The word dictator started to be thrown around. Before too
Dictator
long,
was a good word back then,
new
by the way.
candidates were campaigning for consul.
It wasn't a bad
One
thing.
of the candidates was Milo.
It was an
a
It
conservative
was
senator
a
and
voted in
leader of half of the
position.
city's street gangs. To Clodius, the leader of the other half of the city's street gangs, this was unacceptable. Clodius decided that if Milo was running, there would be no election. He took to the streets, and Rome descended into anarchy. Clodius's gangs and Milo's gangs clashed all over the city. There were deaths every day, and corpses were just left lying openly on the streets. Public business ground to a halt. This continued for months, and the elections kept on being pushed back. When January 1st rolled around, there had been no elections, which meant that, again, there were no new consuls there to assume office. One day in late January, Milo was leaving Rome on business, and just happened to meet Clodius returning to the city on the same road. Each man was flanked by armed bodyguards. The groups almost passed in peace, but two gladiators working for Milo couldn't keep their mouths shut, and started taunting Clodius's men. Fighting broke out spontaneously. In the confusion, Clodius was hit in the shoulder with a javelin. Clodius's men tried to rush him into a building, but Milo's men overpowered them.
Gold smelter.
Clodius
Ooh.
was killed, and his body was just left on the road. Eventually, a traveler recognized Clodius's body and had it sent to Rome. When it got to Rome, news spread of Clodius's death. An angry mob gathered. They took his body and marched toward the Forum. They had intended to hold a funeral in the Forum, but instead, the mob stormed the Senate House. They took tables, chairs, benches, and anything else that would burn, and piled it in the center of the Senate chamber.
Arena with
Clodius's body
4
was
Longbeard
laid atop
units.
the makeshift pyre, and the wood was ignited. In death, Clodius fulfilled his promise. His funeral
I'm thinking
pyre
instead of
burned the
archers,
Senate
I'm gonna
House
go
down.
for air troops.
Rome's senators were horrified by this. Rome had been ungovernable for months, but if an angry mob could burn down the Senate, an angry mob could overthrow the government. The whispering intensified. Dictator. The people wanted Pompey to restore order. Everybody was
I
now
forgot about
taking
that
the
army.
threat
Shit.
of the mob seriously,
But the conservatives in the Senate had an understandable aversion to dictators, so they struck a compromise. Pompey would be allowed to rule as sole consul in the year 52. This was super duper illegal. First, there had to be a 10-year gap between consulships. That was the law. Pompey had served only 3 years earlier. Second, there was no election. The Senate just decided that Pompey would be the next consul. Since when was that a thing? But nevertheless, in the year 52 BCE, Pompey assumed power. When they had their consul in place, Bibulus, maybe you've heard of him, put forward some legislation. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final act. This special piece of legislation gave the consuls, in this case just Pompey, unrestricted power to defend the Republic. It was the Roman equivalent to martial law. The bill passed without much debate. Pompey immediately raised an army and had it enter the city. Just like that, Rome was under military occupation. Legionaries patrolled the streets and fought the street gangs whenever they were found. Eventually, with soldiers on every street corner, people began to go about their daily lives again. As an olive branch, Pompey had Milo arrested for Clodius's murder. Milo was found guilty and was exiled from Rome. The army patrolled the streets for about a month. Peace was restored, and Pompey was the most powerful man in Rome. This is exactly what he wanted. Finally, Pompey had decided that the crisis had passed, and that it was time to relinquish his extra-legal authority. Somewhere in this period, Pompey remarried. He invited his new father-in-law, a leading conservative, to serve with him as consul for the remainder of the year. Again, no election was held. They were just making it up as they went along. Together, Pompey and his father-in-law passed a string of conservative
I'm actually
reforms,
getting really
such as
tired.
a prohibition on
Take care,
candidates
everybody.
standing for office in absentia.
Thank you all for watching.
This was an indirect
Friendly
attack
reminder
on
that the
Caesar
link
of
to
all
who I've been
people,
listening
since
to
it
this whole
would force him to
time
give
is
up
in the
his
description.
command early and get dragged into court
Historius
over his
Civilis.
illegal actions during his term as
Wonderful
consul.
channel. Highly
Pompey
recommend.
and Caesar's
Please go check
alliance
them out.
was broken.
Take
The
care.
triumvirate was dead.
I'm going for a nap.